Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The thing about working night patrol on a rural interstate is that you spend most of your shift alone with your thoughts and the hum of the engine. That's what Trooper Ephraim Calder had come to understand in his 4 years with the Highway Patrol. The silence between radio calls could stretch for hours, broken only by the occasional semi-rumbling past or the distant wail of a coyote somewhere in the scrubland that bordered State Route 47. It was October 2019, and Ephraim had drawn the graveyard shift for the 3rd week running. He didn't mind it much. The darkness had a way of simplifying things, reducing the world to what his headlights could reach and what his instincts could process. That particular night started like any other. He'd clocked in at the district barracks at 2100 hours, gone through the standard vehicle inspection, checked his issued equipment, and pulled out onto the highway just after 2130. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and a thin fog was settling into the valleys along the route. Dispatch had been quiet all evening. A few 10 to 27 checks on license plates, one disabled vehicle near mile marker 83, and a welfare check on a stranded motorist that turned out to be a false alarm. Sergeant Winton Pike had come over the radio twice to confirm Ephraim's 10 to 20, his location, and both times Ephraim had responded with his usual calm brevity. He liked Pike. The man was a 20-year veteran who didn't micromanage and trusted his troopers to do their jobs without constant check-ins. Around 01:30 hours, Ephraim was parked in his usual spot off exit 12, a wide gravel turnout hidden behind a cluster of billboards advertising a truck stop another 15 miles south. It was a good spot for catching speeders coming down the long descent from the ridge, and it gave him a clear view of both lanes. He'd just finished a lukewarm cup of coffee from his thermos when he saw the vehicle. A dark sedan, maybe a Honda or Toyota, traveling southbound at what looked like a reasonable speed. Nothing unusual at first glance, but something about the way it moved caught his attention. The car was drifting slightly, not enough to cross the center line, but enough to suggest the driver was distracted or impaired. Ephraim watched it pass, noted the out-of-state plates, and pulled out onto the highway. He kept a safe distance behind the vehicle for nearly 2 miles, observing. The sedan continued its erratic drift, occasionally correcting sharply before settling back into a loose trajectory. No brake lights, no turn signals, just a slow, wandering path down the empty highway. Ephraim reached for his radio and keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I've got a possible 1055 southbound on State Route 47 near mile marker 79. Running a plate now." He rattled off the numbers and letters, then waited. The dispatcher's voice crackled back after a moment, confirming the registration was active and matched to a female owner in Missouri. No warrants, no flags. Ephraim acknowledged and made his decision. He flipped on his overhead lights. The sedan didn't respond immediately. It continued drifting for another few hundred feet before the brake lights finally came on and the car slowed to a stop on the narrow shoulder. Ephraim pulled in behind it, leaving enough distance between the vehicles in case he needed to move quickly. He noted the time on his dashboard clock, 0147 hours, and reached for the radio again. "Dispatch, 10 to 27 at mile marker 78 southbound shoulder. One occupant visible, appears to be a single female driver." Dispatch acknowledged. Ephraim took a breath, scanned the area, and stepped out of the cruiser. The night air was cold and damp, and the fog had thickened enough that visibility was reduced to maybe 50 yards in either direction. Ephraim adjusted his duty belt, felt the weight of his sidearm and flashlight, and approached the driver's side of the sedan. His boots crunched on the gravel shoulder as he moved, and he kept his right hand resting casually near his hip. Not aggressive, just aware. He'd learned early in his career that most traffic stops were routine, but the ones that weren't could turn bad faster than you could react. He tapped on the window with his flashlight, 2 firm knocks, and stepped back slightly. The window rolled down halfway, and Ephraim found himself looking at a woman in her early 30s. She had pale skin, dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, and eyes that looked red and tired. She didn't smile, didn't offer an excuse, just stared at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not defiant, not scared, just blank. Ephraim kept his tone even and professional. "Evening, ma'am. I'm Trooper Calder with the Highway Patrol. The reason I pulled you over tonight is I observed your vehicle drifting between lanes. I need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance, please." The woman didn't respond right away. She blinked slowly, as if processing his words, then reached over to the passenger seat. Her movements were sluggish, deliberate, and Ephraim's instincts tightened. He shifted his weight slightly, keeping his flashlight trained on her hands. She handed him a Missouri driver's license, and Ephraim glanced at it under the beam of his flashlight. The name read Sable Merritt. The photo matched the woman in front of him, though the image looked a few years older and the woman in the car looked considerably more worn down. He noted the birth date, which put her at 32, and handed the license back. "And your registration and insurance, please." Sable reached into the glove compartment this time, and Ephraim watched her hands carefully. She pulled out a crumpled envelope and handed it over without a word. Ephraim took it, scanned the documents, and everything appeared to be in order. The car was registered to her, and the insurance was current. He leaned down slightly, trying to get a better look at her face. "Ma'am, have you had anything to drink tonight?" Sable shook her head slowly. "No." Her voice was quiet, flat, almost monotone. Ephraim studied her for a moment longer. No odor of alcohol, no slurred speech, but something was off. Her pupils looked normal, not dilated or constricted, but there was a dullness in her expression that suggested exhaustion or something else he couldn't quite place. He decided to probe a little further. "Where are you headed tonight?" Sable hesitated, then answered. "South, just driving." Ephraim frowned slightly. "South, where, specifically?" Another pause. "I don't know, just away." That answer didn't sit right with him. Ephraim straightened up and took a step back, giving himself a better vantage point to see the interior of the car. The back seat was cluttered with bags, clothes, and what looked like a sleeping bag. The passenger seat had a purse, a half-empty water bottle, and a folded road map. Nothing immediately suspicious, but the whole scene felt transient, like she was living out of the car. He glanced back at Sable, who was staring straight ahead now, hands resting on the steering wheel. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle for a moment." Sable's head turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "Why?" Ephraim kept his voice calm but firm. "Just routine. I need to make sure you're safe to continue driving." Sable didn't argue. She opened the door slowly and stepped out onto the shoulder. She was shorter than Ephraim had expected, maybe 5'4", and she was wearing jeans, a gray hoodie, and worn-out sneakers. She looked thin, almost frail, and she moved with a kind of mechanical stiffness that made Ephraim think she'd been sitting in that car for a very long time. He gestured for her to step toward the back of the vehicle, away from the road, and she complied without resistance. Ephraim positioned himself so he could keep an eye on both her and the car, then asked her to perform a few standard sobriety tests. She followed his instructions, walking heel to toe in a straight line, standing on one foot, and following his finger with her eyes. She passed each test without difficulty, though her movements remained slow and disconnected. Ephraim lowered his flashlight and studied her face again. "Ma'am, are you okay? You seem like you're not quite here." Sable's expression didn't change. She looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in that same flat tone. "I'm fine. Can I go now?" Ephraim didn't answer right away. Something about this whole interaction felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate exactly what it was. She wasn't intoxicated, she wasn't combative, and she wasn't breaking any laws. But there was a hollowness to her presence that set off alarms in the back of his mind. He glanced back at the car, then at her. "I'm going to run your information. Make sure everything checks out. Just wait here for a minute." He walked back to his cruiser, keeping an eye on Sable as he moved. She stood where he'd left her, motionless, staring down at the pavement. Ephraim climbed into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut, and reached for the radio. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I need a 1028 and 1029 on a Sable Merritt, Missouri DL." He read off the license number and waited. The dispatcher's voice came back a few moments later, confirming that Sable had no outstanding warrants and no prior record. Clean. Ephraim thanked dispatch and sat back in his seat, thinking. Everything about this stop was by the book. She wasn't impaired, she wasn't wanted, and she hadn't committed any crime beyond a minor traffic infraction. But his gut told him something else was going on. He was about to step back out when the radio crackled again. "Unit 47, this is Sergeant Pike. What's your status?" Ephraim keyed the mic. 1027 in progress, Sarge. Single female driver, no violations beyond erratic driving. She checks clean, but something feels off. There was a pause. Then Pike's voice came back. "Off how?" Ephraim glanced out the windshield at Sable, who hadn't moved. Hard to say. She's cooperative, passes sobriety, but her answers are vague. Says she's just driving south with no destination. Car's packed like she's been living in it. Another pause. "You want backup?" Ephraim considered it, then shook his head, even though Pike couldn't see him. "Negative, I'll handle it. Just wanted you aware." Pike acknowledged and signed off. Ephraim stepped out of the cruiser and walked back toward Sable. She turned her head slightly as he approached, but her expression remained blank. Ephraim stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms. "All right, Ms. Merritt, everything checks out. I'm going to give you a warning for the lane drift, but I need to ask you something. Are you in any kind of trouble? Is there someone you're running from?" Sable's eyes flickered for just a moment, a brief flash of something that might have been fear or anger, but it was gone before Ephraim could process it. She shook her head. "No, I'm just tired." Ephraim studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. "If you're in danger, I can help you. There are resources, shelters, people who can assist if you're in a bad situation." Sable's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time she looked directly at him with something resembling emotion. "I don't need help, I just need to keep moving." Ephraim didn't push further. He could see the walls going up, the defenses locking into place. He'd seen it before with domestic violence victims, people fleeing bad situations who didn't trust law enforcement enough to ask for help. He pulled out his citation book, wrote up a warning for improper lane usage, and handed it to her. "All right, you're free to go, but I'd recommend finding a rest stop or a motel for the night. You look like you need some sleep." Sable took the paper without looking at it and nodded once. "Thank you." She walked back to her car, climbed in, and started the engine. Ephraim watched as she pulled back onto the highway, her taillights disappearing into the fog. He stood there for a moment longer, the cold air biting at his face, before returning to his cruiser. He sat in the driver's seat, staring at the empty road ahead, and tried to shake the feeling that he'd just let something important slip through his fingers. He reached for the radio, almost keyed the mic to call it in again, but stopped himself. What would he even say? That he had a bad feeling? That wasn't enough. Ephraim pulled back onto the highway and continued his patrol. The rest of the shift passed without incident, and by the time he returned to the barracks at 06:30, the sun was beginning to rise over the ridge. He filed his report, noting the traffic stop and the warning issued, and clocked out. But as he drove home, the image of Sable Merritt's blank stare stayed with him, and he couldn't shake the sense that something far darker than a simple traffic stop had just crossed his path. Ephraim didn't sleep well that day. He'd gone home to his small rental house on the outskirts of town, showered, eaten a quick breakfast, and climbed into bed around 0800 hours. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sable Merritt's face, that hollow expression, the way she'd answered his questions with just enough detail to satisfy protocol, but nothing more. He kept replaying the moment when he'd asked if she was in trouble, the brief flicker in her eyes that had vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. By 1400 hours, he gave up on sleep entirely and sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at his phone. He thought about calling Sergeant Pike, running the stop by him again, but what would he say? That he had a feeling? That something about the woman seemed off? Pike was a good supervisor, but he was also a pragmatist. Without concrete evidence of a crime or a clear threat, there wasn't much anyone could do. Ephraim scrolled through his mental notes from the stop. Sable Merritt, Missouri plates, no warrants, no priors, no flags. A warning for lane drift. Clean paperwork, everything by the book. And yet, the unease remained lodged in his chest like a stone. By the time his shift rolled around again that evening, Ephraim had convinced himself he was overthinking it. He'd been doing this job long enough to know that sometimes people were just passing through, running from bad relationships or dead-end jobs, looking for a fresh start somewhere else. It wasn't his job to fix their lives, only to keep the roads safe. He clocked in at 2100 hours, went through his vehicle inspection, and pulled out onto State Route 47 just after 2130. The weather had turned colder, and a light drizzle had started to fall, slicking the pavement and reducing visibility. Dispatch was busier tonight. Multiple calls for minor fender benders and a disabled semi near the county line. Ephraim handled 2 10-27 checks in the first hour, both routine, and was settling into the rhythm of the shift when the radio crackled with Sergeant Pike's voice. Unit 47, this is Sergeant Pike. Can you 10-21 to the barracks when you get a chance? Ephraim frowned slightly. A request to call in wasn't unusual, but Pike's tone carried a weight that suggested this wasn't just administrative. Ephraim keyed the mic. 10-4, Sarge. Give me 5. He pulled off at the next exit, found a well-lit gas station parking lot, and dialed Pike's direct line on his cell. Pike picked up on the second ring. Calder, thanks for calling. I wanted to touch base with you about that stop you made last night. The woman, Merritt. Ephraim sat up a little straighter. What about her? Pike's voice was measured, careful. I got a call this afternoon from a detective out of Missouri. Name's Hackett, works out of St. Louis County. He's been tracking a missing persons case, and your stop from last night came up in their system when they ran a query on recent license checks. Ephraim's grip tightened on the phone. Missing persons? Sable Merritt is missing? Pike hesitated, and Ephraim could hear papers shuffling in the background. Not exactly. Merritt herself isn't the missing person, but she's connected to one. A woman named Joelle Ferris, age 29, went missing from a suburb outside St. Louis about 6 weeks ago. Merritt was the last known person to see her alive. They were roommates. Merritt gave a statement to police. Said Ferris left voluntarily after an argument. But the family isn't buying it. They filed a report, and St. Louis PD has been trying to track Merritt down for a follow-up interview. She stopped showing up at her job, stopped answering her phone, and apparently cleared out of her apartment about 2 weeks ago. Ephraim's mind raced. So she's a person of interest. Pike's voice was cautious. That's the working theory. Hackett was careful not to call her a suspect, but he wants to talk to her. Problem is, she's not returning to Missouri, and without probable cause, there's no warrant. He asked if we could locate her and do a welfare check, maybe get her to call him voluntarily. Ephraim rubbed his face with his free hand. Sarge, I let her go last night. She was headed south on 47. No idea where she went after that. Pike sighed. I know. Hackett knows too. He's not blaming anyone, but he asked if you noticed anything unusual during the stop, anything that might help him build a timeline or understand her state of mind. Ephraim thought back to the encounter. She was tired, really tired. Car was packed, like she'd been living out of it. She said she was just driving south, no specific destination. When I asked if she was in trouble, she shut down, said she didn't need help and just wanted to keep moving. Pike was quiet for a moment. Did she seem scared, evasive? Ephraim considered the question carefully. Not scared, exactly. More like disconnected. Like she was going through the motions, but wasn't really there. I ran her for warrants, came back clean, checked her sobriety, she passed. I gave her a warning and let her go. Pike exhaled. All right, look, I'm not second-guessing your call. You did everything right. But if you see her again, or if anyone else reports a vehicle matching that description, we need to know. Hackett left his contact info. I'll forward it to you. Ephraim nodded even though Pike couldn't see him. Understood. I'll keep an eye out. They ended the call, and Ephraim sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, staring at the rain streaking down his windshield. He thought about Sable Merritt's blank expression, the way she'd avoided giving straight answers, the heaviness in her voice when she'd said she just needed to keep moving. And now there was a missing woman, a roommate who'd vanished after an argument, and Sable was the last person to see her alive. Ephraim pulled back onto the highway, his mind no longer on routine patrol. He scanned every vehicle that passed, looking for that dark sedan, those Missouri plates, the woman with the hollow eyes. The next 3 hours of his shift were uneventful. A few speeders, one drunk driver he arrested near mile marker 65, and a stranded motorist with a flat tire that he helped change. By 100 hours, the rain had stopped, and the roads were quiet again. Ephraim was parked in his usual spot off exit 12 when dispatch came over the radio with a call that made his pulse quicken. All units in the vicinity of State Route 47, we have a report of an abandoned vehicle southbound near mile marker 52. Dark sedan, Missouri plates. Caller reports the vehicle has been parked on the shoulder for over an hour with no occupant visible. Requesting 10 to 27 and welfare check. Ephraim grabbed the mic before anyone else could respond. Dispatch, Unit 47. I'm 1076. Mile marker 52 is approximately 12 miles from my 10 to 20. I'll respond. Dispatch acknowledged, and Ephraim flipped on his lights, pulling onto the highway and accelerating south. The road was empty at this hour, and he covered the distance in under 8 minutes. As he approached mile marker 52, his headlights swept across the shoulder, and he saw it. A dark sedan, parked at an awkward angle, half on the gravel, half on the grass. Missouri plates. Ephraim's stomach tightened. He slowed, pulled in behind the vehicle and hit his spotlight. The beam illuminated the car, and he could see immediately that no one was inside. He keyed the radio. "Dispatch, Unit 47 on scene at mile marker 52. Vehicle matches description, Missouri registration. No occupant visible. I'm 1027 now." Dispatch confirmed, and Ephraim stepped out of his cruiser, hand resting on his sidearm. The night was cold and still, and the only sound was the faint hum of his cruiser's engine. He approached the sedan cautiously, sweeping his flashlight across the windows. The driver's door was unlocked. Ephraim opened it carefully and leaned in. The interior smelled like stale fast food and something faintly chemical, maybe cleaning supplies or air freshener. The back seat was still cluttered with bags and clothes, just like the night before. The keys were gone from the ignition, and there was no purse or phone visible. Ephraim backed away from the car and scanned the surrounding area. The shoulder was wide here, bordered by a steep embankment that dropped down into a drainage ditch. Beyond that was a thick line of trees. He called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "Highway Patrol! If anyone is out here, identify yourself." No response. He walked to the edge of the embankment and shined his flashlight down into the ditch. Nothing. Just weeds and standing water. He returned to his cruiser and radioed dispatch. "Dispatch, Unit 47. Vehicle is registered to Sable Merritt, same individual from my stop last night. No occupant on scene. I'm going to conduct a perimeter search." Dispatch acknowledged, and Ephraim grabbed his flashlight, moving along the shoulder in both directions. He checked the tree line, looking for any sign of foot traffic or disturbance, but the ground was hard-packed and gave up no clues. He returned to the sedan and tried the trunk. It was locked. Ephraim stepped back, considering his options. Without probable cause, he couldn't force entry, but the situation was escalating in his mind. A missing woman from Missouri, a person of interest who'd been cooperative but evasive, and now an abandoned vehicle on a deserted highway in the middle of the night. He keyed the radio again. "Dispatch, I need Sergeant Pike on the line. Priority." A moment later, Pike's voice came through. "Unit 47, this is Pike. Go ahead." Ephraim gave him a quick rundown of the situation, and Pike listened without interrupting. When Ephraim finished, there was a pause before Pike responded. "All right, here's what we're going to do. I'm en route to your location now. In the meantime, I want you to secure the vehicle and establish a perimeter. Do not enter the vehicle or open the trunk without me present. If Merritt shows up, detain her for questioning, but do not arrest unless she gives you cause. Understood?" Ephraim acknowledged and set about securing the scene. He placed road flares behind his cruiser to alert any oncoming traffic and used his spotlight to illuminate the area. Then he waited. Pike arrived 20 minutes later, pulling up in his unmarked SUV. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He stepped out, surveyed the scene, and walked over to Ephraim. "Talk to me." Ephraim ran through everything again, from the initial stop to the phone call with the Missouri detective to the abandoned vehicle. Pike listened, arms crossed, then walked over to the sedan and peered through the windows. He tried the doors, checked the trunk, and returned to Ephraim. "We've got enough for a welfare check, but not enough for a search. The fact that she's connected to a missing persons case gives us some leeway, but we need to tread carefully. I'm going to call Hackett, see if he can expedite any kind of request for assistance. In the meantime, we wait." They stood by the vehicles, watching the empty highway and the dark tree line. Ephraim couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, that Sable Merritt was out there somewhere watching them. Pike made the call to Detective Hackett, speaking in low tones for several minutes before hanging up. He turned to Ephraim. "Hackett's working on getting us authorization to open the trunk, but it's going to take time." He also said something interesting. The missing woman, Joelle Ferris, Her phone pinged off a tower about 40 miles south of here 2 weeks ago, right around the time Merritt disappeared from St. Louis. Then nothing. Phone went dark. Ephraim's jaw tightened. You think Merritt had something to do with it? Pike's expression was grim. I think we need to find her and ask her some questions. And I think we need to figure out what's in that trunk. They waited another hour, the cold seeping into their bones, before Pike's phone rang. He answered, listened, and nodded. Understood, we'll proceed. He ended the call and looked at Ephraim. Hackett got us a verbal authorization from the St. Louis County prosecutor. We're clear to open the trunk under exigent circumstances, welfare check for a potential missing person. Let's do this. Pike retrieved a pry bar from his SUV, and together they approached the sedan. Ephraim's heart was pounding as Pike wedged the tool into the trunk latch and applied pressure. The lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the trunk popped open. Both men stepped back, and Ephraim shined his flashlight inside. The trunk was empty except for a spare tire, a jack, and a canvas tarp folded in the corner. No body, no evidence of foul play, just an empty trunk. Pike exhaled slowly. Well, that's something. Ephraim felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. So, where is she? Pike closed the trunk and looked around. Good question. We'll have the vehicle towed and processed, see if forensics can pull anything useful. In the meantime, I want you to file a full report on both stops and this scene. Include everything, every detail you remember about Merritt's behavior, her answers, anything that stands out. Ephraim nodded. What about Merritt? You want me to put out a bolo? Pike considered it. Not yet. Hackett wants to keep this low-key for now. If we spook her and she runs further, we lose any chance of getting answers. But keep your eyes open. If she surfaces again, I want to know immediately. They wrapped up the scene, and a tow truck arrived to haul the sedan back to the impound lot. Ephraim finished his shift at 06:30, filed his report, and drove home as the sun rose over the ridge. But sleep was even more elusive now. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about Sable Merritt. Where had she gone? Why had she abandoned her car? And what had really happened to Joelle Ferris? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, and Ephraim knew with a sinking certainty that this case was far from over. 3 days passed without any sign of Sable Merritt. Ephraim worked his regular shifts, scanning every vehicle that passed, running plates on dark sedans, stopping twice to check drivers who matched her general description. Both times it was someone else, and both times he felt the frustration building in his chest. The forensics team had gone through Merritt's impounded vehicle with a fine-toothed comb. They'd pulled fingerprints, DNA samples, and trace evidence, but nothing pointed to foul play. No blood, no signs of struggle, no weapons. The car was clean, almost suspiciously so, as if someone had wiped down the interior before abandoning it. The only thing of note was a receipt found wedged under the passenger seat, dated 3 weeks prior from a motel in southern Missouri, about 60 miles from where Joelle Ferris had last been seen. Sergeant Pike had kept Ephraim in the loop, forwarding updates from the Missouri detective who was now coordinating with their department. The detective had obtained phone records for both Merritt and Ferris, and the data painted an unsettling picture. In the week before Ferris disappeared, there had been dozens of calls between the two women, some lasting only seconds, others stretching for nearly an hour. Then, abruptly, the calls stopped. Ferris's phone went dark on a Tuesday afternoon, and Merritt's phone showed a pattern of movement, pinging towers along Interstate 55 as she drove south, eventually crossing into their jurisdiction. After abandoning her vehicle, Merritt's phone had also gone silent. Either she'd turned it off, destroyed it, or ditched it somewhere along the route. Ephraim found himself replaying the initial traffic stop over and over in his mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. Sable Merritt had been cooperative, calm, but there had been that moment when he'd asked if she was in trouble. That flicker of something behind her eyes. Fear? Guilt? Desperation? He couldn't be sure. What he did know was that every instinct he had told him Merritt was running from something, and that something was likely connected to Joelle Ferris's disappearance. The question was whether Merritt was a victim herself, fleeing an abusive situation or a dangerous person, or whether she was the one responsible. On the fourth night after finding the abandoned vehicle, Ephraim was working the same stretch of State Route 47 when dispatch called with another report. A clerk at a 24-hour truck stop near Exit 18 had called in a suspicious person, a woman matching Merritt's description who had been loitering near the restrooms for over an hour. The clerk said the woman looked disheveled, possibly homeless, and had tried to purchase food with a credit card that was declined multiple times. Ephraim's pulse quickened. Exit 18 was only 6 miles from his current position. He keyed the radio. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I'm 1076 to that location. ETA 3 minutes." He flipped on his lights and accelerated. The truck stop was a sprawling complex with fuel pumps, a convenience store, and a small diner attached to one side. Ephraim pulled into the lot, scanning the area. It was busy for the late hour. Several semis idling in the parking area, a few cars at the pumps. He parked near the entrance and stepped out, adjusting his duty belt. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes and a name tag that read Derek, met him at the door. "She's still here," the clerk said, gesturing toward the back of the building. "She went into the women's restroom about 10 minutes ago and hasn't come out." Ephraim nodded. "All right, stay here. If she comes out, don't approach her. Just let me know." Ephraim walked around the side of the building, his flashlight in hand, and positioned himself near the restroom entrance. He called out, his voice firm but not aggressive, "Ma'am, this is the Highway Patrol. I need you to come out and speak with me." There was no response. Ephraim waited, listening. He could hear the faint sound of running water from inside. He knocked on the door. "Ma'am, I'm not here to arrest you. I just need to talk. Please come out." Another long silence, then the sound of a lock clicking. The door opened a few inches, and Ephraim saw Sable Merritt's face in the gap. She looked worse than she had during the traffic stop. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and drawn, and her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she hadn't slept in days. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ephraim kept his tone calm. "I'm not saying you did, but I need to talk to you about your vehicle. You left it on the highway, and we've been concerned about your welfare." Sable's eyes darted past him, scanning the parking lot, then back to his face. "I don't want to talk to you." Ephraim took a small step closer. "I understand, but you're connected to a missing persons investigation, and there are people who need answers. If you're in danger, I can help you, but I need you to come out and talk to me." Sable's hand gripped the edge of the door, her knuckles white. "You can't help me. Nobody can." Ephraim felt his pulse quicken. "Why do you say that? What are you afraid of?" Sable shook her head, and for a moment, Ephraim thought she was going to slam the door, but instead, she opened it wider and stepped out. She was wearing the same gray hoodie from the traffic stop, now stained and wrinkled, and her sneakers were caked with dirt. She looked at Ephraim with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and resignation. "I didn't hurt anyone," she said, "but they think I did." Ephraim gestured toward his cruiser. "Let's sit down and talk. I'm not going to arrest you unless you give me a reason to, but I need to understand what's going on." Sable hesitated, then nodded. Ephraim walked her to the passenger side of his cruiser and opened the door. She climbed in without protest, and Ephraim circled around to the driver's side. He left the door open and the overhead light on, keeping the conversation visible to anyone nearby. He didn't want this to look like an interrogation. He turned to face her, his notepad in hand. "All right, let's start with Joelle Ferris. When was the last time you saw her?" Sable stared down at her hands, which were folded in her lap. "6 weeks ago, we had a fight. She left." Ephraim kept his voice even. "What was the fight about?" Sable's jaw tightened. "Money. She owed me rent, and I told her she needed to pay or move out. She got angry, said I was being selfish, and then she just left. She took her stuff and walked out. I haven't seen her since." Ephraim made a note. "Did she tell you where she was going?" Sable shook her head. "No, she just said she'd figure it out. I tried calling her a few times, but she wouldn't answer. After a week, I stopped trying." Ephraim studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. "Her family filed a missing persons report. They said you were the last person to see her. Why didn't you contact the police when she didn't come back?" Sable's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "Because I didn't think she was missing. I thought she was just avoiding me. People do that. They get mad and they disappear for a while. I didn't think it was a big deal until the cops showed up at my door, asking questions." Ephraim leaned back slightly. "And then you left St. Louis. Why?" Sable's voice dropped. "Because they looked at me like I did something to her. Her family, the cops, everyone. They acted like I was guilty just because we had a fight. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't deal with it." Ephraim kept his eyes on hers. "So you ran." Sable's hands clenched into fists. "I didn't run. I left. There's a difference." Ephraim tapped his pen against the notepad. "You stopped paying rent, quit your job, and drove halfway across the country without telling anyone where you were going. That looks like running." Sable's voice rose slightly. "What was I supposed to do? Sit there and wait for them to arrest me for something I didn't do?" Ephraim held up a hand. "I'm not accusing you of anything, but you have to understand how this looks. Joelle disappears after a fight with you. You leave town without talking to the police. You abandon your car in the middle of the night. None of that looks good." Sable's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I know how it looks, but I didn't hurt her, I swear." Ephraim softened his tone. "Then, help me understand. Why did you abandon your car? Where have you been for the last 3 days?" Sable wiped at her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. "I ran out of gas. I didn't have any money left, and my cards were maxed out. I walked to a rest area a few miles south and slept there for a night. Then I hitched a ride to a town I don't even remember the name of. I've been moving around, trying to figure out what to do." Ephraim considered her story. It was plausible, but it didn't explain everything. "Sable, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you have any idea what happened to Joelle? Anything at all, even if it doesn't seem important?" Sable looked at him for a long moment, and Ephraim saw something shift in her expression. It was subtle, but it was there, a crack in the wall she'd been holding up. "There was someone," she said quietly. "A guy Joelle was seeing. She didn't tell me much about him, but I know he was bad news. She'd come home with bruises sometimes, and when I asked her about it, she'd make excuses. Said she fell or bumped into something. I told her she needed to leave him, but she wouldn't listen." Ephraim leaned forward. "Do you know his name?" Sable shook her head. "She never told me. She was secretive about it, like she was afraid of what I'd say. But I saw him once. He came to the apartment to pick her up. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair and a beard. He drove a black truck, one of those big ones with the lifted suspension. I didn't like the way he looked at me when I answered the door. It was like he was sizing me up, deciding if I was a threat. Ephraim made a note. "Did you tell the police about him?" Sable nodded. "I mentioned it when they came to my apartment, but they didn't seem interested. They kept asking me about the fight, about what I did after Joelle left. It felt like they'd already made up their minds." Ephraim sat back, processing the information. If there was another person involved, someone Joelle had been seeing, that changed the entire dynamic. It also explained why Sable might have felt like a scapegoat. "Sable, I need you to come back to the barracks with me. We need to get this on record, and I need to contact the detective handling Joelle's case. If what you're telling me is true, it could help find her." Sable looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "You believe me?" Ephraim met her gaze. "I believe you're scared, and I believe you know more than you've told anyone, but I can't help you unless you trust me." Sable hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll come with you." Ephraim radioed dispatch to let them know he was transporting a potential witness for questioning, then started the engine. As they drove back toward the barracks, Sable sat in silence, staring out the window. Ephraim's mind was racing. If there was another person involved, someone with a history of violence, it was possible Joelle Ferris was still out there somewhere, or that her disappearance was tied to something far more complex than a roommate dispute. When they arrived at the barracks, Sergeant Pike was waiting in the parking lot. Ephraim had called ahead to fill him in, and Pike's expression was grim as he approached the cruiser. Ephraim stepped out and spoke quietly to Pike while Sable remained in the vehicle. "She says there was a boyfriend, someone Joelle was seeing who had a history of violence. She didn't get a name, but she saw him once. Black truck, tall guy with a beard. She claims she told the Missouri cops, but they didn't follow up." Pike crossed his arms. "That's a significant detail. If it's true, it shifts the focus off Merritt. But we need to verify it. I'll call the detective and see if there's any mention of this in their file. In the meantime, we need to get her statement on record and figure out what to do with her." Ephraim glanced back at the cruiser, where Sable sat with her head resting against the window. "She's not a flight risk anymore. She's exhausted, broke, and out of options. I think she's telling the truth, but we need to be careful. If this boyfriend exists and he finds out she's talking, she could be in danger." Pike nodded. "Agreed. Let's get her inside and start the interview." "And Calder, good work. You kept your head and brought her in without escalating. That's exactly what we needed." They walked Sable into the barracks where a small interview room had been set up. Ephraim sat across from her while Pike observed from the adjacent room. The interview lasted over 2 hours, and by the end, Ephraim had a much clearer picture of what had happened. Sable Merritt was not a suspect. She was a witness, and possibly a victim herself, caught in the orbit of someone far more dangerous than anyone had realized. As the sun began to rise outside, Ephraim filed his report and forwarded the details to the Missouri detective. Sable was placed in protective custody temporarily, given a meal and a place to sleep, while the investigation shifted focus to the mysterious boyfriend. Ephraim left the barracks exhausted, but with a sense that they were finally moving in the right direction. But as he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing a piece of the puzzle, and that whatever had happened to Joelle Ferris was far from over. The break in the case came 5 days later, and it came from an unexpected source. Ephraim was off duty, sitting in his kitchen with a cup of coffee and the morning paper, when his phone rang. It was Sergeant Pike. "Calder, I need you to come in. We've got a development." Ephraim was at the barracks within 20 minutes. Pike met him in the conference room where a laptop was open on the table displaying what looked like surveillance footage. Pike gestured to the screen. This came in from the Missouri detective about an hour ago. It's from a gas station security camera in southern Missouri, dated 2 days before Joelle Ferris was reported missing. Watch. Ephraim leaned forward as Pike hit play. The footage showed a gas station forecourt at night, grainy and washed out by the overhead lights. A black pickup truck pulled up to one of the pumps, and a man got out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a thick beard, exactly as Sable Merritt had described. He filled the tank, then walked into the convenience store. A few moments later, a woman appeared in the frame. She'd been sitting in the passenger seat, and now she climbed out and stood near the truck, arms crossed, looking agitated. Even through the poor quality of the footage, Ephraim recognized her from the missing persons photo. It was Joelle Ferris. The man emerged from the store a minute later carrying a bag. He said something to Joelle, and she shook her head, backing away. The man stepped closer, and his body language shifted. It wasn't overtly aggressive, but there was a tension in the way he moved, a kind of coiled energy. Joelle said something else, pointing toward the road, and the man grabbed her arm. She tried to pull away, and he tightened his grip, yanking her closer. They argued for another few seconds before he released her and climbed back into the truck. Joelle stood there for a moment, then got back into the passenger seat. The truck pulled out of the frame, heading south. Pike paused the video. That's the last confirmed sighting of Joelle Ferris. The gas station is about 40 miles from where her phone last pinged. The detective ran the truck's plates through the system. It's registered to a man named Kyle Treadway, age 36, with a history of domestic violence arrests in 3 different states. He's been off the grid for the last 6 weeks, and his last known address was a trailer park outside of St. Louis. Ephraim felt a chill run down his spine. So Sable was telling the truth. This guy exists, and he was with Joelle right before she disappeared. Pike nodded. That's the working theory. The detective has issued a bolo for Treadway and the truck. But here's where it gets interesting. We got a hit on the truck 2 nights ago. Ephraim's pulse quickened. Where? Pike pulled up a map on the laptop. Automated license plate reader on State Route 47, southbound near mile marker 38. That's less than 20 miles from where you found Merritt's abandoned car. Ephraim stared at the map, his mind racing. He's been in our area this whole time. Pike's expression was grim. It looks that way. The question is why? If he's the one responsible for Joelle's disappearance, why stick around? Why not keep moving? Ephraim thought for a moment. Maybe he's looking for something. Or someone. Pike met his gaze. Sable Merritt. The realization hit Ephraim like a punch to the gut. He knows she can identify him. If Joelle told him about the roommate, he might think Sable knows too much. He could be hunting her. Pike stood up. That's what the detective thinks. And if he's still in the area, we need to find him before he finds her. I've already put in a request for additional patrol units to canvass the southern sectors. I want you back on the road tonight, focusing on mile markers 30 through 50. If that truck shows up again, I want you on it immediately. Ephraim nodded. What about Sable? Is she still in protective custody? Pike shook his head. She was released yesterday. We couldn't hold her any longer without charging her, and she's not a suspect. She's staying at a motel near Exit 22, under a different name. Only a handful of people know where she is. Ephraim felt a knot forming in his stomach. If Treadway's smart, he'll be watching for any connection to her. Motels, gas stations, anywhere she might turn up. Pike placed a hand on Ephraim's shoulder. That's why we need to find him first. Get some rest, then gear up for tonight. This could get messy. Ephraim left the barracks and spent the rest of the day trying to sleep, but his mind wouldn't shut down. He kept seeing Joelle Ferris in that gas station footage. The way she'd tried to pull away from Kyle Treadway, the fear in her body language. He thought about Sable Merritt, alone in a motel room, unaware that the man she'd warned them about was potentially circling closer. By the time Ephraim clocked in for his shift that evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the highway. He pulled out onto State Route 47 and drove south, his eyes scanning every vehicle, every turnoff, every dark shape on the shoulder. Dispatch had been briefed on the situation, and Sergeant Pike was monitoring the radio from the barracks. The first few hours of the shift were quiet. Ephraim made several passes through the target area, checking rest stops, abandoned properties, and any place a truck might be hidden. He ran dozens of plates, stopped 2 vehicles that matched the general description, but neither was Treadway. By 0200 hours, Ephraim was starting to think they'd missed him, that he'd already moved on to another jurisdiction. Then the radio crackled. "All units, we've got a possible sighting of the suspect vehicle. Black pickup truck matching the Bolo, parked at a rest area off exit 22. Caller reports the vehicle has been stationary for over 30 minutes. Requesting immediate response." Ephraim's heart slammed against his ribs. Exit 22. That was the same exit where Sable's motel was located. He grabbed the mic. "Dispatch, Unit 47 responding. ETA 4 minutes. He flipped on his lights and accelerated, the cruiser's engine roaring as he closed the distance. Pike's voice came over the radio. "Unit 47, I'm en route to your location. Do not engage until I arrive. Observe and report only." Ephraim acknowledged, but his mind was already running through scenarios. If Treadway was at that rest area, he was either taking a break or he was waiting for something, or someone. Ephraim pulled off at exit 22 and slowed as he approached the rest area. It was a small facility, just a parking lot with restrooms and a couple of vending machines surrounded by trees. He killed his lights and coasted into the lot, scanning the area. There were 3 vehicles parked near the restrooms, 2 cars and a black pickup truck. Ephraim's pulse spiked. The truck matched the description. Lifted suspension, oversized tires, Missouri plates. He parked at the far end of the lot, keeping his cruiser out of direct sight, and grabbed his binoculars. Through the lenses, he could see the truck more clearly. The cab appeared empty, but the engine was running. A faint plume of exhaust rose from the tailpipe. Ephraim scanned the rest of the lot. No one was visible near the restrooms or the vending machines. He keyed the radio, keeping his voice low. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I've got eyes on the suspect vehicle. Truck is running, no occupant visible. I'm holding position until Sergeant Pike arrives." Dispatch acknowledged, and Ephraim settled in to wait. Every second felt like an eternity. He kept his hand near his sidearm, his eyes locked on the truck. Then movement. A figure emerged from the tree line at the edge of the lot. It was a man, tall and broad, moving with a deliberate stride toward the truck. Ephraim raised the binoculars and confirmed what he already knew. Kyle Treadway. Treadway climbed into the truck and sat there for a moment, then pulled out a phone and appeared to be checking something. Ephraim's mind raced. If Treadway was here, near Sable's motel, that couldn't be a coincidence. Ephraim made a decision. He couldn't wait for Pike. He keyed the radio. "Dispatch, suspect is on the move. I'm initiating a traffic stop." He started the cruiser, flipped on his lights, and pulled out of his position. The truck's headlights came on, and it began to roll forward. Ephraim accelerated, closing the distance, and positioned himself behind the truck. For a moment, he thought Treadway was going to pull over. The truck slowed, easing toward the shoulder. Then, suddenly, the engine roared, and the truck shot forward. Ephraim's instincts kicked in. He floored the accelerator, the cruiser surging ahead. "Dispatch, Unit 47 in pursuit. suspect vehicle fleeing southbound on State Road 47 from exit 22. The radio exploded with chatter as dispatch coordinated additional units, but Ephraim's focus was locked on the truck ahead. Treadway was driving aggressively, swerving between lanes, accelerating to speeds well over 90 miles per hour. Ephraim stayed on him, his hand steady on the wheel, his eyes tracking every movement. The pursuit stretched for miles, the highway empty except for the two vehicles. Treadway took a sharp exit onto a secondary road, and Ephraim followed, the cruiser's tires screeching as he made the turn. The secondary road was narrow and winding, bordered by dense forest. Treadway's truck had the advantage in power, but Ephraim's training and experience kept him close. They raced through the darkness, the only sound the roar of engines and the wail of the cruiser's siren. Then, without warning, Treadway slammed on the brakes. Ephraim reacted instantly, yanking the wheel to avoid a collision, and the cruiser skidded onto the shoulder. Treadway threw the truck into reverse and rammed into the front of the cruiser, the impact jarring Ephraim hard against his seatbelt. Before Ephraim could recover, Treadway was out of the truck and running into the trees. Ephraim grabbed his radio, his voice breathless. "Dispatch, suspect is on foot, fleeing into the woods off County Road 14. I need backup now." He climbed out of the cruiser, drew his sidearm, and plunged into the forest after Treadway. The trees were thick, and the darkness was almost total. Ephraim's flashlight cut through the blackness, sweeping back and forth as he moved. He could hear Treadway ahead of him, crashing through the underbrush. Ephraim pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his heart pounding. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. Ephraim froze, his flashlight and sidearm raised. The forest was silent except for the distant wail of sirens approaching. He scanned the area, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then he saw it, a shape, low to the ground, partially hidden behind a fallen tree. Ephraim moved closer, keeping his weapon trained on the shape. "Highway Patrol, show me your hands." The shape didn't move. Ephraim took another step, and his flashlight illuminated the scene. It was Treadway lying on his side, one arm pinned beneath him. Ephraim approached cautiously, keeping his sidearm ready. "Don't move. Put your hands where I can see them." Treadway groaned, and Ephraim saw blood on the man's forehead. He'd tripped or fallen in the dark and hit his head on something. Ephraim holstered his weapon and pulled out his cuffs, securing Treadway's hands behind his back. Within minutes, backup arrived. Sergeant Pike emerged from the trees with two other troopers, and together they hauled Treadway to his feet and walked him back to the road. Treadway was treated by paramedics for a minor head wound, then transported to the county jail. Ephraim stood by his damaged cruiser, catching his breath as Pike approached. "Hell of a night, Calder." Ephraim nodded, still processing everything. "He was hunting her, Sarge, I'm sure of it. If we hadn't caught him tonight, he would have found Sable." Pike's expression was somber. "You did good work. You kept your head, and you closed this thing." But as Ephraim drove back to the barracks in a replacement cruiser later that night, he didn't feel like celebrating. Kyle Treadway was in custody, and Sable Merritt was safe. But Joelle Ferris was still missing. Treadway wasn't talking, and without a body or a confession, the investigation would continue. Days turned into weeks, and the case remained open. Ephraim returned to his regular patrols, but the image of Sable Merritt's hollow eyes stayed with him. He thought about the women who passed through his jurisdiction every night. The ones fleeing bad situations. The ones running towards something or away from something, and he wondered how many of them he'd never know about. One evening, about a month after Treadway's arrest, Ephraim was fueling up at a gas station when he saw a familiar face. Sable Merritt was standing at the next pump over, filling a different car. She looked healthier, more present, though there was still a sadness in her eyes that Ephraim recognized. She saw him and offered a small tentative smile. Trooper called her. Ephraim nodded. "Miss Merritt, how are you holding up?" She shrugged. "Taking it one day at a time. I'm heading west, trying to start over somewhere new." Ephraim wanted to ask her about Joelle, about whether she thought Treadway would ever tell them what happened, but he didn't. Some questions didn't have answers, and some wounds didn't heal. Instead, he said, "Take care of yourself out there." Sable nodded, replaced the nozzle, and climbed back into her car. Ephraim watched as she pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the highway, just another set of taillights fading into the night. He finished fueling, climbed back into his cruiser and returned to the road, where the darkness waited and the next shift was just beginning. Trooper Ansel Ridgely had been with the Highway Patrol for 11 years, and in that time he'd worked more accident scenes than he could count. Fender benders, rollovers, multi-vehicle pileups in fog and ice. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. But the call that came through on a gray November morning in 2022 would prove to be different. It started like any other shift. Ansel clocked in at 0600 hours at the district barracks, completed his vehicle inspection, and pulled out onto Interstate 81 just as the sun was beginning to rise over the valley. The temperature hovered around 38 degrees, and a light mist hung in the air, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. Dispatch had issued warnings about slick road conditions, and Ansel knew it was going to be a busy morning. By 0730 hours, he'd already responded to 2 minor accidents, both single-vehicle slide-offs with no injuries. He was filling out paperwork on the second one when the radio crackled with a new call. "All units in the vicinity of Interstate 81 northbound, we have reports of a multi-vehicle accident near mile marker 142. Multiple callers reporting serious injuries. Requesting immediate response and EMS." Ansel keyed the mic without hesitation. "Dispatch, Unit 23 responding. ETA 6 minutes. He flipped on his lights and siren and accelerated north. Mile marker 142 was in a stretch of highway known for its sharp curves and steep grades, a notorious spot for accidents during bad weather. As Ansel approached the scene, he could see the flashing hazard lights of several vehicles ahead. He slowed, scanning the area to assess the situation. What he saw made his stomach tighten. It wasn't just a multi-vehicle accident, it was a catastrophic pile-up. At least 7 vehicles were involved, scattered across both northbound lanes and the shoulder. A sedan was crumpled against the concrete barrier on the left. A pickup truck had rolled onto its side in the median. A delivery van was jackknifed across the right lane, and behind it, 3 more cars were smashed together in a tangled mess of metal and glass. Ansel pulled onto the shoulder about 50 yards back from the wreckage and immediately radioed dispatch. "Dispatch, Unit 23 on scene. Confirming multi-vehicle pileup, at least 7 vehicles involved. I need fire, EMS, and additional patrol units immediately. Close northbound lanes at mile marker 140 and establish a detour." Dispatch acknowledged, and Ansel stepped out of his cruiser. The air smelled of gasoline and burnt rubber, and he could hear the hiss of steam escaping from a ruptured radiator somewhere in the pile. He grabbed his reflective vest and road flares, moving quickly to secure the scene. Traffic was already backing up behind the wreckage, and he needed to prevent another collision. He placed flares at intervals leading up to the crash site, then waved oncoming traffic toward the shoulder, directing them to slow down and merge into the single open lane. Within minutes, 2 more patrol units arrived, and Ansel briefed them quickly before moving toward the vehicles to assess casualties. The first vehicle he reached was the sedan against the barrier. The driver's side was caved in, and the windshield was shattered. Ansel peered through the broken glass and saw a woman slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. Blood streaked her face, and her breathing was shallow. Ansel tried the door, but it was jammed. He moved to the passenger side, forced it open, and leaned in to check her vitals. Weak pulse, labored breathing. He keyed his shoulder mic. "Dispatch, I've got a critical patient in the first vehicle, female driver, unconscious and unresponsive. EMS needs to prioritize this one." He placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, trying to stabilize her neck, and waited for the paramedics. The next vehicle was the rolled pickup truck. Ansel approached carefully, mindful of the possibility of fuel leaks or fire. The truck was on its passenger side, and through the shattered driver's window he could see a man trapped inside, conscious but clearly in pain. The man's leg was pinned beneath the crumpled dashboard, and his face was pale and slick with sweat. Ansel crouched down, making eye contact. "Sir, I'm Trooper Ridgely with the Highway Patrol. Help is on the way. Can you tell me your name?" The man's voice was hoarse. Tom Palliser. My leg. I can't feel my leg." Ansel kept his tone calm and reassuring. "Tom, I need you to stay as still as possible. The fire department is en route and they're going to get you out. Just hang in there." Ansel moved on to the delivery van. The driver was standing outside, pacing near the rear doors, visibly shaken but apparently uninjured. Ansel approached him. "Sir, are you hurt?" The driver shook his head. "No, I'm okay, but I don't know what happened. One second I was driving and the next, cars were slamming into each other. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop in time." Ansel placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "It's all right. Just stay here and don't move your vehicle. We're going to need statements from everyone." The driver nodded, and Ansel continued his sweep. The 3 cars behind the van were in the worst condition. They'd collided in rapid succession, creating a chain reaction that left them fused together in a twisted heap. Ansel approached the first car, a small hatchback, and saw 2 occupants inside. The driver, a young man, was conscious and crying, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The passenger, a woman about the same age, was silent and still. Ansel opened the driver's door. "Sir, are you injured?" The young man turned to him, his face streaked with tears. "She's not moving. Please, you have to help her." Ansel leaned across and checked the woman's pulse. It was there, faint but steady. She was unconscious, but alive. "She's breathing. Help is coming. I need you to stay calm and stay in the vehicle unless I tell you otherwise." Ansel moved to the second car in the chain, a mid-size sedan. The driver was an older man, maybe in his 60s, slumped against the airbag. Ansel checked his vitals. No pulse. He stepped back, his jaw tightening. 1 fatality, possibly more. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, be advised we have at least 1 confirmed fatality on scene. Continue EMS response and notify the coroner." The third car was empty. The doors were open and there was no sign of the driver. Ansel frowned. He scanned the area looking for anyone who might have exited the vehicle, but saw no one. That was strange. In a crash this severe, it was unlikely someone would just walk away, especially without checking on the other victims. The sound of sirens grew louder, and within moments fire trucks and ambulances began arriving on scene. Ansel flagged down the first paramedic unit and directed them to the sedan with the unconscious woman. The fire department immediately set to work on the rolled pickup, using hydraulic tools to cut through the metal and free Tom Palliser. Ansel stepped back, letting the emergency crews take over, and returned to his cruiser to begin coordinating the scene. As the senior trooper on site, it was his responsibility to manage the investigation, document everything, and ensure the scene was processed correctly. He pulled out his incident report form and began making notes. 7 vehicles involved, at least 1 fatality, multiple critical injuries. Cause of the pileup was still unclear, but the weather and road conditions were likely contributing factors. He was in the middle of sketching a diagram of the vehicle positions when another patrol unit pulled up. It was Sergeant Vance, the shift supervisor. Vance stepped out of his vehicle and approached Ansel. "Ridgely, what's the situation?" Ansel gave him a quick rundown, and Vance nodded, his expression grim. "All right, I want you to start interviewing witnesses as soon as they're stable enough to talk. We need to piece together how this happened and find out who was driving that third car. If they left the scene, we've got a potential hit and run on top of everything else." Ansel nodded and returned to the crash site. By now, the paramedics had stabilized several of the victims and were loading them into ambulances. Ansel approached the delivery van driver who was still standing near his vehicle, watching the chaos unfold. "Sir, I need to ask you a few questions. Can you walk me through what happened?" The driver nodded, wiping his hands on his jacket. "I was heading north, doing about 55, maybe 60. The roads were slick, so I was being careful. Then I saw brake lights ahead, a lot of them. I started slowing down, but the car in front of me just stopped. No warning, no gradual braking, just a full stop. I hit my brakes, but I couldn't stop in time. I clipped the back of that sedan, and then everything just exploded. Cars were hitting each other from behind, spinning out. It was like dominoes." Ansel made notes. "Did you see what caused the initial stop? Was there an obstruction in the road, debris, an animal?" The driver hesitated. "I don't know. I didn't see anything. The car just stopped." Ansel thanked him and moved on to the next witness, the young man from the hatchback. He was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance now, a blanket draped over his shoulders. Ansel approached gently. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you what you remember." The young man looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "We were just driving. My girlfriend and I were heading to her parents' house. The traffic slowed down, and I slowed down too, but the car in front of us stopped suddenly. I hit the brakes, but we slid into them. Then someone hit us from behind, and then again, and again. I don't even know how many times." Ansel's pen hovered over his notepad. "The car in front of you, the one that stopped first, do you remember what it looked like?" The young man shook his head. "I don't know. It was dark, maybe blue or black. A sedan, I think. But I wasn't paying attention to the car. I was trying not to hit it." Ansel thanked him and stepped away. He was starting to see a pattern. Multiple witnesses were describing the same thing. A vehicle ahead of them had stopped suddenly and without warning, triggering the chain reaction. But no one could identify the vehicle, and it appeared to be missing from the scene. Ansel walked back to the area where the third car in the chain had been. The empty car. He examined it more closely now, noting the damage. The rear end was crumpled from being hit by the vehicle behind it, but the front end showed minimal damage. It hadn't collided with anything ahead of it. Ansel crouched down and looked inside. The interior was clean, no personal items, no registration visible in the visor or glove compartment. He tried the glove box, but it was locked. He stood up and walked around to the rear of the vehicle, noting the license plate. He radioed it in to dispatch. "Dispatch, Unit 23. I need a registration check on a plate." He read off the numbers and waited. The response came back a minute later. "Unit 23, that plate is registered to a 2019 sedan. Owner listed as Harold Mingus, address in Harrisburg. No wants or warrants on file." Ansel frowned. Harold Mingus. The name meant nothing to him, but the fact that the vehicle's owner wasn't on scene was deeply troubling. He keyed the radio again. "Dispatch, can you attempt contact with the registered owner? I need to know if this vehicle was reported stolen or if the owner was driving at the time of the accident. Dispatch acknowledged, and Ansel returned to his cruiser to wait. Around him, the scene was beginning to clear. The fire department had successfully extracted Tom Palliser from the rolled pickup, and he was being loaded into an ambulance. The paramedics were working on the unconscious woman from the first sedan, preparing her for transport. The coroner had arrived and was examining the fatality in the second car. Ansel watched it all unfold, his mind turning over the details. Something about this crash didn't add up. Dispatch came back over the radio. Unit 23, we've attempted contact with Harold Mingus at the listed address. No answer. We've left a message requesting callback. No reports of the vehicle being stolen. Ansel acknowledged and sat back in his seat. If the vehicle wasn't stolen and the owner wasn't answering, where was he? And why had he left the scene? Ansel stepped out of the cruiser and walked over to Sergeant Vance, who was coordinating with the fire chief. Sarge, I think we've got a problem. One of the vehicles involved, a sedan registered to a Harold Mingus, is empty. No driver on scene, and the owner isn't answering his phone. The car's position suggests it was one of the first to stop, possibly the one that triggered the whole pile-up. Vance's expression darkened. You're saying someone walked away from a crash that killed at least one person and critically injured several others? Ansel nodded. It looks that way, and if that car was the cause of the initial stop, we need to find the driver immediately. Vance pulled out his phone and made a call, presumably to the district commander, while Ansel returned to the scene. He wanted to examine the sedan more closely, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened. As he approached the vehicle again, something caught his eye. On the passenger seat, partially hidden beneath the deployed airbag, was a cell phone. Ansel pulled on a pair of gloves, carefully lifted the airbag, and retrieved the phone. The screen was cracked, but it was still powered on. He pressed the home button, and the lock screen appeared. It showed a missed call notification and a text message preview. The message was from a contact labeled C. Vaughn, and read, "Where are you? We've been waiting for over an hour." Ansel stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. C. Vaughn. That name was familiar, but he couldn't place it immediately. He bagged the phone as evidence and radioed Vance. "Sarge, I found a cell phone in the empty vehicle. There's a recent text from someone named C. Vaughn. I think we need to follow up on this." Vance's voice came back, sharp and focused. "Bag it and tag it. I'll have someone run the name. In the meantime, keep working the scene. We need answers, Ridgely." Ansel returned to his cruiser and began compiling his notes. The scene was slowly clearing now. The injured transported, the fatality removed, and the vehicles being prepared for towing. But the questions remained. Who was Harold Mingus? Where had he gone? And what had caused him to stop in the middle of the highway, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction? As the tow trucks began hauling away the wreckage, Ansel stood on the shoulder, staring at the empty space where the sedan had been. He had a feeling this investigation was just beginning, and that the answers, when they came, would be far more complicated than anyone expected. By noon, the crash site had been cleared and traffic was flowing again on Interstate 81. Ansel Ridgely had spent the last 4 hours documenting every detail, photographing skid marks, measuring distances between impact points, and collecting witness statements. The physical evidence was being cataloged and prepared for transport to the state forensics lab, but the mystery of the missing driver weighed heavily on his mind. He returned to the barracks to file his preliminary report and wait for updates from dispatch. Sergeant Vance had assigned 2 additional investigators to assist with the case, recognizing that this was more than a simple traffic accident. It had the potential to be a vehicular homicide investigation, and they needed to move quickly. Ansel was sitting at his desk, reviewing his notes, when his phone rang. It was dispatch. "Trooper Ridgely, we've got a development on your crash investigation. The The phone you recovered from the vehicle, we ran the number through our system. It's registered to Harold Mingus, same as the vehicle owner. But we also pulled recent call logs, and there's something you need to see. The last outgoing call from that phone was made at 0723 hours this morning, 4 minutes before the first 911 call about the crash came in. It was a 3-minute call to a local number. Ansel's pen hovered over his notepad. Do we have an ID on who he called? Dispatch paused. The number belongs to Cyrilla Vaughn. She's a paramedic with County EMS, works out of Station 7. Ansel felt a chill run down his spine. Cyrilla Vaughn, the name from the text message on Mingus's phone. And she was a paramedic, someone who would have been called to the scene of the crash. Was she on duty this morning? Did she respond to the crash? Dispatch came back after a moment. Affirmative. She was part of the first EMS unit to arrive on scene at 0741 hours. She's currently at County Medical Center with one of the critical patients from the crash. Ansel stood up, grabbing his jacket. I'm heading to the hospital now. Let Sergeant Vance know. He ended the call and walked quickly out of the barracks. The pieces were starting to come together, but they didn't make sense yet. Harold Mingus had called Cyrilla Vaughn minutes before the crash, and then Vaughn had responded to the scene as a paramedic. What was the connection? The drive to County Medical Center took 15 minutes. Ansel parked in the emergency department lot and made his way inside. The hospital was busy, the waiting room filled with patients and families. Ansel approached the reception desk and showed his badge to the clerk. I'm looking for Cyrilla Vaughn. She's a paramedic who brought in a patient from a crash on I-81 this morning. The clerk checked her computer. She's in the EMS break room, down that hall, second door on the left. Ansel thanked her and followed the directions. He found the break room, a small utilitarian space with a few chairs, a coffee maker, and a vending machine. Cyrilla Vaughn was sitting at a table, still in her EMS uniform, staring at her phone. She looked up as Ansel entered, and he immediately noticed the tension in her posture. She was in her early 30s with short auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Ansel introduced himself. Ms. Vaughn, I'm Trooper Ridgely with the Highway Patrol. I need to ask you a few questions about the crash on I-81 this morning. Cyrilla set her phone down slowly. I already gave a statement to the incident commander on scene. I don't know what else I can tell you. Ansel pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. This isn't about your response to the scene. This is about Harold Mingus. Cyrilla's expression shifted, just slightly, but Ansel caught it. A flicker of recognition, maybe concern. What about him? Ansel kept his tone neutral. His vehicle was involved in the crash. He wasn't on scene when we arrived, and we haven't been able to locate him. But we found his phone in the car, and the call logs show he contacted you just minutes before the crash. I need to know what that call was about. Cyrilla leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Harold is my cousin. He called me this morning because he was supposed to meet me for breakfast. He was running late, and I was annoyed, that's all. Ansel nodded, making notes. What time were you supposed to meet? Cyrilla's voice was steady. 7:30, at a diner off exit 145, about 3 miles north of where the crash happened. Ansel looked up from his notepad. So he was heading north to meet you when the crash occurred. Cyrilla nodded. I assume so, but he never showed up. I waited until almost 8, then I got called out to the crash. I didn't know his car was involved until just now. Ansel studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. Her answers were calm and measured, but there was something underneath, a tension she was trying to hide. When you responded to the crash, did you see Harold? Did you recognize his vehicle? Cyrilla shook her head. I was focused on the patients. I didn't pay attention to the vehicles. We had multiple critical injuries, and my job was to stabilize and transport. I didn't have time to look around. Ansel shifted gears. When Harold called you this morning, how did he sound? Was he upset, distracted, anything unusual? Cyrilla hesitated, and Ansel saw the crack in her composure. She looked down at her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter. He sounded off, not himself. He said he was running late, but there was something in his voice, like he was stressed or worried about something. I asked him if he was okay, and he said he was fine, but I didn't believe him. Ansel leaned forward slightly. Did he say anything else? Anything that might explain why he stopped in the middle of the highway? Cyrilla's eyes met his, and for the first time, Ansel saw genuine fear. He said something strange. He said, "I think I made a mistake, Cyrilla, a bad one." I asked him what he meant, but he just said he had to go and hung up. That was the last time I heard from him. Ansel's mind raced. A mistake. What kind of mistake would make someone stop their car on a busy highway in bad weather? Do you have any idea what he was referring to? Was he in some kind of trouble? Cyrilla shook her head. I don't know. Harold and I aren't that close. We see each other a few times a year. Family gatherings, that kind of thing. He's always been quiet, keeps to himself, but he's never been in trouble, as far as I know. Ansel made more notes, then looked back at Cyrilla. I'm going to need you to come down to the barracks and give a formal statement, and I need you to provide any communication you've had with Harold in the last few weeks. Texts, emails, anything. Cyrilla's jaw tightened. Am I a suspect? Ansel kept his voice even. Right now, you're a witness, but your cousin's actions may have caused a fatal accident, and he's missing. I need to find him, and you're the last person he spoke to. Anything you can tell me might help. Cyrilla stood up, her arms still crossed. I'll come to the barracks, but I'm telling you, I don't know where he is, and I don't know what he did. Ansel stood as well. I believe you, but we need to figure this out, and quickly. He escorted Cyrilla out of the hospital and back to his cruiser. On the drive to the barracks, she was silent, staring out the window. Ansel glanced at her occasionally, trying to read her. She was scared, that much was clear, but whether it was fear for Harold or fear of what he might have done, Ansel couldn't tell. Back at the barracks, Ansel brought Cyrilla into an interview room and had her wait while he briefed Sergeant Vance. Vance listened to the update, his expression growing darker. A cousin who's a paramedic, a phone call minutes before the crash, and a cryptic statement about making a mistake. This is adding up to something, but I don't like where it's going. Ansel nodded. I want to bring in an investigator to interview her properly. I also want to pull Harold Mingus's financials, phone records, everything. If he's running from something, there'll be a trail. Vance agreed and made the necessary calls. Within an hour, a criminal investigator named Lieutenant Goss arrived to take over the interview with Cyrilla. Ansel observed from behind the two-way mirror as Goss went through the questions again, this time more methodically. Cyrilla's answers remained consistent, but Goss pressed harder on certain points, particularly the nature of Harold's mistake. Cyrilla insisted she didn't know, but Goss wasn't convinced. Ms. Vaughn, your cousin called you in what appears to be a moment of crisis. He said he made a bad mistake, and then he stopped his car in the middle of a highway, causing a chain reaction that killed one person and critically injured several others. You expect me to believe you have no idea what he was talking about? Cyrilla's composure finally cracked. I don't know. He didn't tell me. He just said he made a mistake and hung up. I thought maybe he was talking about being late or forgetting something. I didn't think it was anything serious. Goss leaned back in his chair. Or maybe you knew exactly what he was talking about, and you're protecting him. Cyrilla's eyes flashed with anger. I'm not protecting anyone. I came here voluntarily. I answered your questions. If Harold did something wrong, I want to know what it was just as much as you do. Goss let the silence hang for a moment, then changed tactics. When was the last time you saw Harold in person? Cyrilla took a breath, calming herself. About 3 weeks ago, at my mother's house for a family dinner. Goss made a note. And how did he seem then? Cyrilla thought for a moment. Quiet, like I said. He's always been that way. But he seemed more distant than usual. He left early, said he had to get home. Goss looked up. Did anyone else notice? Did your mother or other family members say anything about his behavior? Cyrilla shook her head. Not that I remember. But we're not a close family. People come and go from those dinners all the time. Goss nodded, then stood up. All right, Ms. Vaughn. You're free to go for now, but I need you to stay available. If we need to speak with you again, you'll need to come in immediately. And if Harold contacts you, you call us right away. Understood? Cyrilla nodded and left the interview room. Ansel met her in the hallway and walked her out to the parking lot. As she reached her car, she turned to him. Trooper, do you think Harold's in danger? Or do you think he's dangerous? Ansel hesitated, then gave her the only honest answer he could. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Cyrilla nodded, got into her car, and drove away. Ansel returned to the barracks where Vance and Goss were waiting. Goss spoke first. She's hiding something. I don't know what, but she knows more than she's saying. Ansel wasn't sure he agreed, but he kept his thoughts to himself for now. Vance pulled out a folder. We got the preliminary financials on Harold Mingus. Nothing unusual. Steady job as an accountant, modest income, no major debts, but we did find something interesting. 2 days ago, he withdrew $5,000 in cash from his savings account. That's a significant amount for someone with his income. Ansel frowned. People don't pull out that kind of cash unless they're planning something, paying someone off, running, or preparing for something they can't do with a credit card. Goss nodded. Exactly. And there's more. We pulled his phone records for the last month. Most of his calls are routine, work, family, that kind of thing. But there's a number that shows up repeatedly over the last 2 weeks. We traced it to a burner phone, no name attached. Ansel felt his pulse quicken. How many calls? Goss checked his notes. 17 in total. The last one was made yesterday evening at 2143 hours. It lasted 6 minutes. Ansel looked at Vance. We need to find that burner phone. If Harold was communicating with someone using an untraceable number, and he withdrew a large amount of cash, he was involved in something he didn't want anyone to know about. Vance nodded. Agreed. I'm putting out a bolo for Harold Mingus. If he's still in the area, we'll find him. In the meantime, I want you to keep digging into his background. Talk to his employer, his neighbors, anyone who might know what he was into. Ansel spent the rest of the afternoon making calls. Harold Mingus's employer confirmed that he'd been acting strangely in recent weeks, missing deadlines and calling in sick more frequently. His neighbors described him as quiet and unremarkable, someone who kept to himself and rarely caused any trouble. But one neighbor mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car parked outside Harold's house late at night on several occasions over the past 2 weeks. A dark SUV with tinted windows. The neighbor couldn't provide a plate number or any other identifying details, but it was another piece of the puzzle. As evening approached, Ansel sat at his desk, staring at the growing file on Harold Mingus. The man had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no apparent motive for causing a deadly crash. But the cash withdrawal, the burner phone calls, and the cryptic statement to Cyrilla all pointed to something darker. Ansel's phone rang. It was the state forensics lab. They'd processed the evidence from the crash scene, and the lead technician had something to share. "Trooper Ridgely, we found something in Harold Mingus's vehicle that you need to know about. There were trace amounts of blood on the passenger seat and the floor mat. Not a lot, but enough to test. We ran it through the database, and it's not a match to Harold Mingus. It belongs to someone else." Ansel's stomach tightened. "Do we have an ID?" The technician hesitated. "Not yet. The DNA isn't in our system. But we can tell you it's from a male, and based on the degradation, the blood is relatively fresh. Probably within the last 24 to 48 hours. Ansel thanked the technician and hung up. He immediately called Vance and relayed the information. Vance's response was immediate and decisive. "This just became a potential homicide investigation. I want Harold Mingus found, and I want him found now. And I want to know whose blood is in that car." Ansel agreed and began coordinating with the investigative team. But as he worked, one question kept circling in his mind. If Harold Mingus had killed someone, where was the body? And what had driven him to stop his car in the middle of a highway, triggering a chain reaction that would bring everything crashing down? The bolo for Harold Mingus went out across 3 counties within the hour. Every patrol unit, every municipal police department, every sheriff's deputy had his description and photo. But as the evening turned into night, there were no sightings. It was as if Mingus had vanished into thin air after walking away from the crash scene. Ansel Ridgely couldn't shake the image of that empty sedan, the deployed airbag, the cracked phone with its cryptic message. Someone had been bleeding in that car, and that someone wasn't Harold Mingus. The question was whether that person was still alive, and if not, where the body was. At 1900 hours, Ansel received a call from the forensics lab. The technician had more information about the blood evidence. "Trooper Ridgely, we've analyzed the blood pattern on the passenger seat. Based on the distribution and volume, we believe the source was sitting in that seat for an extended period, possibly injured, but not critically. There's no arterial spray, no indication of a fatal wound at that location. But there are drag marks on the floor mat, suggesting the person was moved or pulled from the vehicle." Ansel's grip tightened on the phone. So, whoever was bleeding might still be alive. The technician's voice was cautious. "It's possible, but without knowing the nature of the injury or how long ago this occurred, I can't say for certain." Ansel thanked the technician and immediately called Sergeant Vance. "Sarge, we need to expand the search. If someone was injured and removed from Mingus's vehicle, they could be anywhere within a radius of the crash site. We should be checking hospitals, urgent care facilities, even veterinary clinics if someone's desperate enough." Vance agreed. "I'll coordinate with the local PDs and get officers checking medical facilities. But Ridgely, I want you to go back to the crash site. Take another look in daylight now that we know what we're looking for. If Mingus moved someone out of that car before or after the crash, there might be evidence we missed." Ansel grabbed his gear and headed back out to Interstate 81. By the time he arrived at mile marker 142, it was fully dark. The highway was quiet now, the wreckage long since cleared, only the skid marks and debris field remaining as evidence of the morning's chaos. Ansel parked on the shoulder and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The temperature had dropped into the 20s and his breath misted in the cold air. He walked slowly along the shoulder, sweeping his flashlight across the ground, looking for anything that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation. He moved methodically, checking the area where Mingus's sedan had been positioned, then expanding outward in a grid pattern. Most of what he found was typical crash debris: broken glass, plastic fragments, scraps of metal. But then, about 15 feet from where the sedan had been, his flashlight caught something different. A dark stain on the gravel shoulder, roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate. Ansel crouched down and examined it closely. It could have been oil or transmission fluid, but something about the color and texture made him think otherwise. He pulled out an evidence kit from his cruiser, carefully collected a sample and bagged it. He continued his search, moving further from the immediate crash site. About 30 yards south, near the edge of the tree line that bordered the highway, he found something else. Drag marks in the dirt, leading from the shoulder into the woods. They were faint, partially obscured by fallen leaves, but unmistakable. Someone or something heavy had been pulled through here. Ansel's pulse quickened. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 23. I need backup at mile marker 142 southbound side. I've found what appears to be drag marks leading into the woods off the shoulder. Possible connection to the Mingus investigation." Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol units arrived, along with the Sergeant Vance. Ansel briefed them quickly, and together they entered the tree line, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The drag marks continued for about 50 feet, winding between trees and over uneven ground before ending at a small clearing. And there, partially covered by branches and leaves, was a body. Ansel's stomach turned. The victim was a man, probably in his 40s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. His face was pale, eyes closed, and there was a significant amount of dried blood on his shirt, concentrated around his abdomen. Ansel immediately checked for a pulse, knowing it was likely futile. There was none. The man was dead. Vance keyed his radio, calling for the coroner and a forensic team. "Dispatch, we have a 10:54 at mile marker 142, approximately 50 feet into the tree line on the southbound side. Notify the coroner and crime scene investigators. This is now a homicide investigation." Ansel stepped back from the body, his mind racing. This was the source of the blood in Mingus's car. This man had been sitting in that passenger seat, injured, and then Harold Mingus had moved him here, into the woods, and left him to die. But why? What had led to this? Vance approached, his expression grim. "Ridgely, I need you to secure this scene. No one in or out except forensics. I'm going to coordinate with homicide detectives and get them out here immediately." Ansel nodded and began establishing a perimeter with crime scene tape. As he worked, he couldn't stop looking at the body, trying to piece together the sequence of events. The man had been injured, possibly in Mingus's car. Mingus had driven him to this location, or close to it, and then dragged him into the woods, but the crash had happened miles north of here. Had Mingus driven south with the dying man in his car, pulled over here to hide the body, and then driven back north toward his meeting with Cyrilla Vaughn? And if so, what had caused him to stop in the middle of the highway, triggering the pileup? The forensic team arrived within the hour, along with 2 homicide detectives. Ansel recognized one of them, Detective Orlin, a veteran investigator with a reputation for being thorough and uncompromising. Orlin approached the body, studied it for a few moments, then turned to Ansel. "Walk me through what you found." Ansel explained the blood evidence in the car, the drag marks, and the location of the body. Orlin listened without interrupting, then crouched down next to the victim. "Looks like a stab wound to the abdomen. Single entry point, probably a knife. He would have bled out slowly, maybe over an hour or more depending on the damage. If he was in Mingus's car when this happened, Mingus would have known he was dying." Ansel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. So Mingus stabbed him, drove him here and dumped him? Orlin shook his head. Not necessarily. The wound could have been inflicted elsewhere, and Mingus could have been trying to get him to a hospital. But something changed his mind. He brought him here instead and left him to die. The question is why? Orlin stood up and looked at Ansel. "You said Mingus was supposed to meet his cousin for breakfast, but he never showed up. He called her minutes before the crash, said he made a mistake. What if the mistake was this? What if he realized what he'd done, panicked, and couldn't go through with meeting her? Ansel considered it. It made a certain kind of sense, but it didn't explain the burner phone calls or the cash withdrawal. There was more to this than a single act of violence. Orlin seemed to read his thoughts. There's something else going on here. Mingus didn't just snap and kill someone. This was planned, or at least part of something bigger. We need to ID this victim and figure out how he connects to Mingus. The forensic team began processing the scene, photographing the body, collecting evidence, and searching the surrounding area for anything that might provide clues. Ansel stayed on the perimeter, watching and waiting. Around midnight, one of the forensic techs called out, "Detective, we've got something." Orlin and Ansel moved over to where the tech was crouched near the edge of the clearing. The tech held up a small object in a gloved hand. It was a wallet, partially buried under leaves. Orlin took it carefully and opened it. Inside was a driver's license, credit cards, and about $40 in cash. Orlin read the name on the license aloud. Victor Landry, age 43, address in Harrisburg. Ansel pulled out his notepad and wrote down the name. Victor Landry. He didn't recognize it, but that didn't mean anything yet. Orlin handed the wallet to the forensic tech for bagging and turned to Ansel. I need you to run this name through the system. See if there are any connections to Harold Mingus. Employment records, financial ties, criminal history, anything. Ansel nodded and returned to his cruiser. He called dispatch and had them run a full background check on Victor Landry. The results came back within 15 minutes. Victor Landry had no criminal record, but he did have an interesting employment history. For the past 8 years, he'd worked as a private investigator, licensed and bonded, operating out of a small office in downtown Harrisburg. Ansel's mind began to turn. A private investigator. That opened up a lot of possibilities. Had Landry been investigating Mingus? Or had Mingus hired Landry to investigate someone else? And how did that lead to Landry ending up dead in the woods? Ansel relayed the information to Orlin, who processed it silently for a moment. A PI. That changes things. If Landry was investigating Mingus, or if Mingus hired him and something went wrong, it could explain the burner phone. PIs use them all the time to protect client confidentiality. Ansel nodded. And the cash withdrawal could have been a payment. $5,000 is a reasonable fee for a private investigation, depending on the scope. Orlin agreed. We need to get into Landry's office, pull his files, see if there's anything on Mingus. I'll get a warrant started tonight. As Orlin walked away to make calls, Ansel stood alone at the edge of the clearing, staring at the covered body of Victor Landry. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. Harold Mingus had hired, or been investigated by, a private investigator. That investigator had ended up stabbed and left to die in the woods. Mingus had driven away, heading toward a breakfast meeting with his cousin, but had stopped his car on the highway, causing a fatal crash. What had made him stop? Guilt? Fear? Or something else entirely? Ansel's radio crackled. It was dispatch. Unit 23, we've got a report of a possible sighting of Harold Mingus. Anonymous caller says they saw a man matching his description at a bus station in Wilkes-Barre, approximately 30 miles west of your location. Wilkes-Barre PD is responding now. Ansel's pulse spiked. Dispatch, I'm 1076 to that location. Notify Wilkes-Barre PD that I'm en route and to detain the subject if possible. He ran to his cruiser, started the engine, and pulled out onto the highway. Vance's voice came over the radio. Ridgely, do not engage alone. Wait for backup. Ansel acknowledged, but his foot pressed harder on the accelerator. 30 miles. If it was really Mingus, he could be long gone by the time backup arrived. The drive to Wilkes-Barre took 25 minutes. lights and sirens clearing the way. Ansel pulled into the bus station parking lot and saw 2 Wilkes-Barre PD units already on scene. He parked and approached the officers who were standing near the entrance. One of them, a sergeant, turned to him. "You the state trooper? We got here about 5 minutes ago. Station attendant says a man matching your bolo description bought a ticket to Philadelphia about 20 minutes ago. Bus already left." Ansel's heart sank. "Did anyone get a positive ID? Security footage?" The sergeant nodded. "We're pulling the footage now. Attendant says the guy paid cash, kept his head down, didn't say much, but he seemed agitated, kept looking over his shoulder." Ansel followed the sergeant inside to the station office, where the attendant was queuing up security footage on a small monitor. The video showed a man in a dark jacket and baseball cap approaching the ticket window. His face was partially obscured, but when he turned slightly to look behind him, Ansel got a clear view. It was Harold Mingus, no doubt. Ansel's jaw tightened. "What time does that bus get to Philadelphia?" The attendant checked his schedule. "It's an express. Should arrive around 2:30 hours. Ansel looked at his watch. It was just past midnight. He had 2.5 hours. He immediately called Sergeant Vance. "Sarge, confirmed sighting of Mingus at Wilkes-Barre bus station. He's on a bus to Philadelphia, ETA 0230. I need Philadelphia PD to intercept that bus and detain him." Vance's response was quick. "I'm on it. I'll coordinate with Philly PD and have them waiting at the station. You stay there and secure that footage. We need it for evidence." Ansel agreed and spent the next hour working with the Wilkes-Barre officers to copy the security footage and take statements from the station attendant. By era 1:30, he was back on the road, heading east toward Philadelphia. He wanted to be there when they brought Mingus in. The drive took just over an hour. Ansel arrived at the Philadelphia bus terminal at 0245, just as the bus from Wilkes-Barre was pulling into the bay. A half-dozen Philadelphia PD officers were waiting, positioned strategically around the terminal. Ansel parked and joined them, showing his badge to the commanding officer, a lieutenant named Corso. "Your guy should be on that bus. We're ready to move as soon as passengers start disembarking." Ansel nodded, his eyes locked on the bus. The doors hissed open and passengers began filing out. One by one, they stepped onto the platform, most looking tired and disoriented. Ansel scanned each face, waiting for Mingus. But as the last passenger stepped off and the bus sat empty, Ansel felt his stomach drop. Harold Mingus wasn't among them. Corso frowned and approached the bus driver. "You come straight from Wilkes-Barre?" The driver nodded. "Yeah, no stops except for one bathroom break at a rest area about 40 minutes outside of Philly." Corso looked at Ansel. He must have gotten off at the rest stop. Ansel's frustration boiled over. Mingus had slipped through their fingers again. He was out there somewhere, and now they had no idea where he was headed. Ansel returned to his cruiser and sat in silence for a long moment. Harold Mingus had killed a man, or at least left him to die. He'd caused a crash that resulted in another death and multiple injuries. And now he was running, using cash and burner phones and every trick he could think of to stay ahead of the law. But why? What had Victor Landry uncovered that was worth killing for? And what mistake had Mingus made that had driven him to stop his car in the middle of a highway, as if the weight of it all had become too much to bear? Ansel started the engine and headed back toward the barracks. The night had given them answers, but it had also raised more questions. And somewhere out there, Harold Mingus was still running. The warrant to search Victor Landry's office came through at 0600 hours. Ansel Ridgely had been awake for nearly 24 hours, running on coffee and adrenaline, but he wasn't about to let someone else execute the search. This case had become personal. He'd worked the crash scene, found the body, and watched Harold Mingus slip away twice. He needed to understand what had driven a seemingly ordinary man to commit murder and then self-destruct in such a public, catastrophic way. Sergeant Vance accompanied him to Landry's office, along with Detective Orlin and 2 evidence technicians. The office was located in a converted brownstone in downtown Harrisburg, wedged between a bail bondsman and a tax preparation service. The building manager let them in, clearly disturbed by the police presence. Landry's office was on the 2nd floor, a modest 2-room suite with a reception area and a private office in the back. The reception area was sparse, just a desk with an outdated computer, a few filing cabinets, and a small waiting area with worn furniture. The private office was where Landry had clearly spent most of his time. The walls were lined with file boxes, and the desk was covered with papers, photographs, and a laptop. Ansel pulled on gloves and began carefully sorting through the materials while the evidence techs photographed everything. Most of the files appeared to be routine cases: insurance fraud investigations, background checks, surveillance for divorce proceedings, standard work for a private investigator. But then Ansel found a file that made him stop. It was labeled simply HM and contained a thin stack of documents. Ansel opened it and began reading. The first page was a contract dated 3 weeks prior, signed by Harold Mingus, hiring Victor Landry to conduct a discreet investigation into personal matters. The contract was vague, offering no specifics about what Mingus wanted investigated, but it confirmed the payment: $5,000, half up front, half upon completion. Ansel flipped to the next page and found handwritten notes in what appeared to be Landry's writing. The notes were fragmented, but certain phrases jumped out. Subject: unaware of surveillance. Meeting locations confirmed. Third party involved. Financial discrepancies noted. Ansel called Orlin over. "Look at this. Mingus hired Landry to investigate someone, but the file doesn't say who. Just references to surveillance, meetings, and financial irregularities." Orlin studied the notes, his expression thoughtful. If Mingus hired Landry to investigate someone close to him, someone who didn't know they were being watched, that could explain the burner phone. Mingus wouldn't want a paper trail linking him to the investigation. Ansel nodded. But what did Landry find that got him killed? Orlin flipped to the next page in the file. It was a printout of bank statements, heavily redacted, but showing large cash deposits into an account that wasn't Mingus's. The account holder's name was blacked out, but someone had written in the margin, "Source unknown, possible embezzlement or fraud." Ansel's mind raced. Mingus suspected someone of stealing from him, or from a business he was involved with. He hired Landry to prove it. But when Landry found evidence, something went wrong. Orlin's voice was grim. Maybe Landry tried to blackmail Mingus, or maybe Mingus realized the investigation had exposed something he wanted to keep hidden. Either way, it ended with Landry dead in the woods. Ansel continued searching the file and found a photograph clipped to the back. It showed 2 people sitting at a table in what looked like a restaurant. One was a woman in her 30s with short, auburn hair. The other was a man Ansel didn't recognize, older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a suit. Ansel's breath caught. He recognized the woman immediately. It was Cyrilla Vaughn. He held up the photo for Orlin to see. "That's Mingus's cousin, the paramedic." Orlin leaned in, studying the image. "Who's the man she's with?" Ansel shook his head. "I don't know, but Landry was surveilling her. That means Mingus hired him to investigate his own cousin." The implications hit Ansel like a freight train. Harold Mingus had suspected Cyrilla Vaughn of something, theft, fraud, or worse, and had hired Victor Landry to gather evidence. But what had Landry discovered and how had it led to his death? Orlin pulled out his phone. I'm calling in Cyrilla Vaughn for another interview. This time, we're not letting her walk out until we get the truth. Within 2 hours, Cyrilla Vaughn was sitting in an interview room at the barracks, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. Ansel and Orlin sat across from her, the photograph from Landry's file placed on the table between them. Orlin spoke first, his tone measured but firm. Ms. Vaughn, we need to talk about your relationship with Harold Mingus. And this time, I need you to be completely honest with me. Cyrilla's eyes flicked to the photograph, and Ansel saw the color drain from her face. Where did you get that? Orlin leaned forward. From the office of Victor Landry, the man whose body we found in the woods yesterday. The man your cousin killed. Cyrilla's hands trembled as she reached for the photograph. I don't understand. Why would Victor Landry have a picture of me? Orlin's voice hardened. Because Harold hired him to investigate you. He suspected you of something, and Landry was gathering evidence. What was it, Ms. Vaughn? What were you doing that made your own cousin hire a private investigator? Cyrilla's composure crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know Harold was investigating me. Ansel leaned forward. Then tell us what happened. Start from the beginning. Cyrilla took a shaky breath. About 6 months ago, Harold approached me. He said he'd started a small investment fund with some money he'd inherited from our grandmother. He asked if I wanted to invest. I didn't have much, but I put in $10,000. He promised me a good return, said he was working with a financial advisor who specialized in high-yield investments. Ansel made notes. Who was the financial advisor? Cyrilla's voice was barely above a whisper. His name was Richard Colby. He was older, very professional. I met with him a few times. He showed me projections, explained the strategy. It all seemed legitimate. Orlin tapped the photograph. This man in the picture with you. Is that Richard Colby? Cyrilla nodded. Yes, that was taken about a month ago. He wanted to meet for coffee to discuss my portfolio. He said the fund was doing well, and I'd see my first distribution soon. Orlin exchanged a glance with Ansel. And did you receive any distributions? Cyrilla shook her head. No. Every time I asked, Richard said the market was volatile and they were waiting for the right time to liquidate. I started to get suspicious, but I trusted Harold. He was family. Ansel felt the pieces clicking into place. Harold wasn't suspicious of you. He was suspicious of Richard Colby. He thought Colby was running a scam, and he hired Landry to prove it. Cyrilla looked up, her eyes wide. A scam? But Harold was the one who brought me into the fund. Why would he investigate his own investment? Orlin's expression was dark. Because he realized too late that Colby was conning both of you. And when Landry confirmed it, Harold confronted him. Ansel picked up the thread. But the confrontation went wrong. Maybe Landry was working with Colby, or maybe Mingus just lost control. Either way, Landry ended up dead. Cyrilla's hands covered her face. Oh God, Harold killed him? Orlin didn't answer directly. We need you to tell us everything you know about Richard Colby. Where he lives, how to contact him, anything. Cyrilla wiped her eyes and nodded. I have his phone number and his business card. He said he worked out of an office in Harrisburg, but I've never been there. We always met at restaurants or coffee shops. Orlin stood up. Give us the information. We're going to find Richard Colby, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. Cyrilla provided the details, and Orlin immediately passed them to the investigative team. Within the hour, they had traced Richard Colby to an address in Harrisburg. But when officers arrived, the apartment was empty. Kolbe had cleared out, leaving behind nothing but a few pieces of cheap furniture and a stack of unpaid bills. The phone number Cyrilla had given them went straight to voicemail, and the business address Kolbe had provided turned out to be a mail drop. Ansel sat in the conference room with Vance and Orlin, reviewing what they knew. Harold Mingus had been conned out of his inheritance by a man named Richard Colby, who had posed as a financial advisor. Mingus had hired Victor Landry to investigate, and Landry had confirmed the fraud. But instead of going to the police, Mingus had confronted someone, either Landry or Colby, and it had ended in violence. Landry was dead. Colby was in the wind, and Mingus was running from a murder charge and the wreckage of his life. Vance broke the silence. "We need to find Colby. If he's behind this, he might know where Mingus is headed." Orlin nodded. "I've got our fraud unit pulling records on Colby. If he's running a con, there'll be a trail. Bank accounts, aliases, prior victims. We'll find him." Ansel stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot. He thought about Harold Mingus sitting in his car on that foggy highway, minutes after leaving Victor Landry to die in the woods. Mingus had been driving to meet Cyrilla, perhaps to confess what he'd done, or to warn her about Colby. But something had stopped him. Guilt, fear, or the sheer weight of his actions had paralyzed him, and he'd simply stopped moving. And in that moment of paralysis, 7 other vehicles had crashed into him, killing 1 person and injuring many more. 2 days later, the break came. A patrol officer in western Pennsylvania reported a man matching Harold Mingus's description walking along a rural road near the Ohio border. The officer had attempted to make contact, but the man had fled into a wooded area. A search was organized, involving state police, K-9 units, and a helicopter. Ansel joined the search, driving through the night to reach the location. By the time he arrived, the search teams had been combing the woods for hours. It was cold, below freezing, and the chances of Mingus surviving the night without shelter were slim. At dawn, one of the K-9 units picked up a scent trail. Ansel followed the handler and the dog through dense underbrush, his breath misting in the frigid air. After nearly an hour, the dog stopped at the base of a large oak tree. The handler signaled, and Ansel moved forward cautiously. Harold Mingus was sitting with his back against the tree, his face pale and lips blue from the cold. His eyes were open, but he was barely conscious. Ansel knelt down and checked his pulse. It was weak, but present. "Harold, can you hear me? It's Trooper Ridgely. We're going to get you help." Mingus's eyes focused on Ansel, and he tried to speak, but his voice was too faint to hear. Ansel called for the paramedics, who arrived minutes later and began treating him for hypothermia. Mingus was transported to a hospital, where he was stabilized and placed under guard. Ansel waited outside the room while doctors worked, and several hours later, Mingus was conscious and able to speak. Ansel sat by his bedside, a recording device on the table between them, and read Mingus his rights. Mingus waved his right to an attorney and agreed to talk. His voice was hoarse and weak. "I didn't mean to kill him, Victor. I didn't mean to." Ansel kept his tone neutral. "Tell me what happened." Mingus closed his eyes. "I hired him to investigate Richard Colby. I suspected Colby was stealing from the fund, from me and Cyrilla and others. Victor confirmed it. He showed me proof. But when I confronted Victor, he said he wanted more money to turn over the evidence. He said Colby had paid him to keep quiet." Ansel's jaw tightened. Landry had been dirty. "So you fought him?" Mingus nodded. "I didn't plan it. We were in my car, arguing. I had a knife in the glove compartment, something I kept for emergencies. He reached for it, or I thought he did. We struggled, and I stabbed him. I didn't realize how bad it was until I saw the blood. I panicked. I drove to the woods and dragged him out. I thought maybe he'd survive. Maybe someone would find him, but I knew he wouldn't. I killed him." Mingus's voice broke. "I was going to tell Cyrilla everything. I was going to turn myself in. But then I just stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. And then the crash happened." Ansel listened as Mingus described the moments leading up to the pileup. He'd been sitting in his car, paralyzed by guilt and fear, when a vehicle behind him had tried to brake but couldn't stop in time. The chain reaction had followed. Mingus had climbed out of his car in the chaos and walked away, convinced that he'd caused even more death and that there was no way to undo what he'd done. He'd been running ever since, not toward anything, just away from everything. Ansel finished recording the statement and stood up. "Harold, Richard Colby is still out there. We need to find him. Do you have any idea where he might be?" Mingus shook his head. "He's gone. He took everything and disappeared. You'll never find him." But Mingus was wrong. 3 weeks later, Richard Colby was arrested at a hotel in Miami, attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands using a false passport. He was extradited back to Pennsylvania and charged with fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. The investigation revealed that Colby had been running investment scams for over a decade, defrauding dozens of victims out of millions of dollars. Harold Mingus was charged with second-degree murder in the death of Victor Landry and vehicular manslaughter in the death of the man who had died in the pileup. He pled guilty to both charges and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Ansel attended the sentencing hearing. He watched as Harold Mingus stood before the judge, a broken man who had destroyed his own life and the lives of others in a desperate attempt to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Cyrilla Vaughn was in the gallery, her face a mask of grief and disbelief. After the hearing, Ansel approached her outside the courthouse. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," he said quietly. Cyrilla looked at him, her eyes hollow. "He was just trying to protect me, to get my money back, and it destroyed him." Ansel nodded. "Sometimes the choices we make to protect people are the ones that hurt them the most." Cyrilla walked away without another word, and Ansel stood on the courthouse steps, watching the traffic pass by. He thought about the crash scene, the empty sedan, the body in the woods, and the man who had lost everything because he couldn't let go of his anger and his need for justice. The case was closed, the perpetrators punished, but there was no satisfaction in it. Only the weight of knowing that a single moment of violence had rippled outward, claiming lives and shattering families. Ansel returned to his cruiser and drove back to the highway. There would be other calls, other crashes, other investigations. The road never stopped, and neither did the work. But this case would stay with him, a reminder that every decision made in a moment of crisis carried consequences that could never be fully anticipated or controlled. Trooper Luther Pritchard had been riding with a rookie for 3 weeks now, and he was starting to remember why he usually preferred working alone. The rookie's name was Odelia March, fresh out of the academy with barely 2 months on the job, and she had that eager, nervous energy that all new troopers seemed to carry. She asked too many questions, second-guessed every decision, and seemed convinced that every call was going to turn into something dramatic. Luther had been a field training officer for 7 years, and he'd learned to be patient with rookies, but Odelia tested that patience more than most. Still, she was sharp, observant, and willing to learn. That counted for something. It was early March 2023, and the winter had been brutal across northern Montana. Snow still covered the ground in thick drifts along State Highway 287, and the temperature hovered around 15 degrees even at midday. Luther and Odelia were working the day shift, covering a 70-mile stretch of highway that connected 2 small towns and passed through vast expanses of ranch land and national forest. Traffic was light this time of year, mostly locals and the occasional semi hauling goods between distribution centers. The radio had been quiet all morning, just a few routine checks and one disabled vehicle that had turned out to be a rancher with a flat tire. Around 30 hours, dispatch came over the radio with a new call. All units in the vicinity of Highway 287, we have a report of an abandoned vehicle at mile marker 64, just past the junction with County Road 12. Caller reports the vehicle has been there for at least several hours. No occupants visible. Requesting welfare check. Luther reached for the mic. Dispatch, Unit 19 responding. We're approximately 10 miles south of that location. ETA 12 minutes. Dispatch acknowledged, and Luther glanced at Odelia, who was already pulling out her notepad. "You ready for this?" he asked. Odelia nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, sir. What do you think we're looking at?" Luther kept his eyes on the road. Could be anything. Broken down vehicle. Someone who ran out of gas and walked to find help. Or it could be something more serious. We treat it like a welfare check until we know otherwise. Odelia wrote something in her notepad, and Luther suppressed a smile. She took notes on everything, as if she was going to be tested later. The drive to mile marker 64 took them through open ranch land, with barbed wire fences running alongside the highway and snow-covered fields stretching to the horizon. As they approached the location, Luther slowed and scanned the shoulder. There it was, about 50 yards ahead. A dark blue SUV, parked at an angle on the gravel shoulder, its rear end jutting out slightly into the traffic lane. Luther pulled in behind the vehicle, leaving enough distance for safety, and activated his overhead lights. Dispatch, Unit 19 on scene. Vehicle is a dark blue SUV, appears to be a Ford Explorer. No occupants visible. I'm running the plate now. He read off the license plate number and waited while dispatch ran it through the system. Odelia was already out of the cruiser, circling the SUV and peering through the windows. Luther watched her for a moment, then stepped out himself. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and biting. He adjusted his jacket and walked toward the vehicle. Dispatch came back over the radio. Unit 19, that plate is registered to a 2018 Ford Explorer. Owner listed as Sandra Colfax, address in Great Falls. No wants or warrants on file. Luther acknowledged and approached the driver's side of the SUV. The windows were frosted over, but he could see through the cleared sections. The interior was empty, no occupants, but there were signs of recent use. A coffee cup in the center console, a phone charger plugged into the dashboard, a jacket draped over the passenger seat. Luther tried the door. It was unlocked. He opened it carefully and leaned in, scanning the interior more closely. The keys were gone from the ignition, and there was no purse or wallet visible. He checked the glove compartment and found the vehicle registration confirming it was registered to Sandra Colfax. Odelia came around to his side. "Sir, I found something." Luther followed her to the rear of the vehicle. She pointed to the ground near the back bumper. There were footprints in the snow, leading away from the SUV and toward the tree line about 30 yards off the highway. The prints were small, probably from a woman's boot, and they were relatively fresh, not yet filled in by wind or new snowfall. Luther crouched down and examined them. She walked away from the vehicle. Question is why and where did she go? Odelia looked toward the tree line. Should we follow the tracks? Luther stood up and considered it. Not yet. First, we need to clear the vehicle, make sure there's nothing inside that gives us more information. Then we'll decide. They searched the SUV thoroughly. In the back seat, they found a duffel bag containing clothes, toiletries, and a laptop. In the cargo area, there was a sleeping bag, a cooler, and some camping gear. It looked like Sandra Colfax had been on a trip, possibly camping or staying somewhere remote. But there was no note, no indication of mechanical trouble, and no signs of foul play. Luther radioed dispatch. Dispatch, Unit 19. Vehicle appears abandoned, but no signs of distress or emergency. We've located footprints leading away from the vehicle into the tree line. I'm going to conduct a perimeter search. Have EMS on standby in case we find an injured party. Dispatch acknowledged, and Luther turned to Adelia. All right, we're going to follow those tracks, but we stay together and we stay alert. If she's out there and she's injured or in trouble, we need to find her quickly. This cold can kill in a matter of hours. Odelia nodded, and they set off towards the tree line. The snow was deep, and the going was slow. The footprints led in a relatively straight line, suggesting the person who made them had a specific destination in mind. After about 50 yards, the tracks veered slightly to the right, following the contour of the land. Luther scanned the area constantly, looking for any sign of movement or additional tracks. The forest was dense here, mostly pine and spruce, with underbrush buried under several feet of snow. After another 100 yards, the footprints stopped at the base of a large pine tree. Luther and Odelia approached cautiously. There were signs that someone had been here recently. The snow was disturbed, as if someone had sat or knelt, and there was a small pile of broken branches nearby, possibly an attempt to build a fire that had been abandoned. But there was no one here now. Luther crouched down and examined the area more closely. He found a scrap of fabric caught on a low branch, a piece of flannel or wool, dark red in color. He bagged it carefully and looked around. The footprints continued from this point, heading deeper into the forest. Odelia spoke quietly. "Sir, do you think she's lost? Or running from something?" Luther stood up, his breath misting in the cold air. "I don't know yet, but the fact that she left her vehicle unlocked, with her belongings inside, and walked out here in the middle of winter suggests she was either in a panic or she had a reason to leave in a hurry." They continued following the tracks. The forest grew denser, and the terrain became more uneven. After another quarter-mile, the footprints led them to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a crude shelter, made from branches and a tarp, partially collapsed. Luther approached it carefully, Odelia close behind. The shelter was empty, but there were more signs of recent occupation. A makeshift fire pit with cold ashes, a water bottle half buried in the snow, and another piece of fabric, this time a glove. Luther picked up the glove and examined it. It was damp and frozen, but relatively new. He radioed dispatch. "Dispatch, Unit 19. We've located what appears to be a temporary shelter in the woods, approximately a quarter-mile from the abandoned vehicle. No occupant present, but there are signs of recent use. I'm going to continue the search. Can you attempt contact with the registered owner, Sandra Colfax, and see if anyone has reported her missing?" Dispatch acknowledged and promised to follow up. Luther and Odelia continued their search, but after another hour of tracking through the forest, the footprints became erratic, crossing back over themselves and leading in circles. It was clear that whoever had made them was disoriented, possibly hypothermic. The tracks eventually led them to a frozen creek bed, where they disappeared entirely. Luther stood at the edge of the creek, scanning the area. She either crossed here and the tracks were covered by wind, or she followed the creek. Either way, we've lost the trail. Odelia looked worried. "What do we do now?" Luther made a decision. "We call in a search and rescue team. If Sandra Colfax is out here and she's been exposed to this cold for hours, she's in serious danger. We need more bodies, K9 units, and a helicopter if the weather allows." They returned to the highway, retracing their steps, and Luther coordinated with dispatch to organize a full search operation. By the time they reached the cruiser, it was nearly 1600 hours and the temperature was dropping. Within 30 minutes, 2 more patrol units arrived, along with a volunteer search and rescue team from the nearest town. Luther briefed them on what they'd found, and the search was organized into grid patterns, with teams spreading out from the abandoned SUV. As the search continued, Luther received an update from dispatch. Unit 19, we've attempted contact with Sandra Colfax at her listed address in Great Falls. No answer at the residence, but we spoke with a neighbor who says Colfax left 3 days ago, said she was going camping alone to clear her head. The neighbor described her as upset, possibly dealing with personal issues, but didn't elaborate. Luther processed the information. Sandra Colfax had been camping alone, possibly dealing with emotional distress, and had abandoned her vehicle for reasons unknown. That painted a troubling picture. People who went into the wilderness alone to deal with personal issues sometimes didn't come back. By nightfall, the search had expanded to cover several square miles, but there was still no sign of Sandra Colfax. The temperature had dropped to near zero, and the search was suspended until morning. Luther and Odelia returned to the barracks where they filed their reports and prepared for the next day's search. Odelia was quiet, clearly affected by the situation. Luther sat down next to her in the break room. "You did good work today. You stayed focused and followed procedure. That's all you can do in a situation like this." Odelia looked at him. "Do you think we'll find her?" Luther was honest. "I don't know, but we'll keep looking until we do." The next morning, the search resumed at first light. Luther and Odelia joined the teams again, this time focusing on areas further from the vehicle. A helicopter had been brought in, equipped with thermal imaging, and it circled overhead, scanning the forest for heat signatures. By 1,000 hours, the helicopter crew reported a possible contact. Luther and his team moved quickly toward the coordinates, trudging through deep snow and dense underbrush. When they reached the location, they found Sandra Colfax. She was lying in a hollow beneath a fallen tree, barely conscious, her skin pale and her lips blue. She was alive, but barely. Luther immediately called for the paramedics and began first aid, wrapping Sandra in thermal blankets and checking her vitals. Her pulse was weak and her breathing shallow. She was severely hypothermic. The paramedics arrived within minutes and took over, stabilizing her and preparing her for airlift to the nearest hospital. As they worked, Sandra's eyes fluttered open briefly, and she looked at Luther. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He's still out there." Luther leaned closer. "Who's still out there, Sandra? Who are you talking about?" But Sandra's eyes closed again, and she lost consciousness. The paramedics loaded her into the helicopter and it lifted off, disappearing over the trees. Luther stood in the clearing, staring at the spot where Sandra Colfax had been lying. Odelia approached him. "Sir, what did she mean? Who's still out there?" Luther shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." He radioed the search teams and ordered them to expand the search, looking for any signs of another person in the area. If Sandra had been fleeing from someone, or if someone else was lost in these woods, they needed to find them quickly. The forest was vast, and the cold was unforgiving. As the search continued, Luther couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple abandoned vehicle call. Sandra Colfax's words echoed in his mind. "He's still out there." The expanded search continued throughout the afternoon, with teams combing through sectors of forest that hadn't been covered during the initial sweep. Luther Pritchard coordinated with the incident commander, a veteran search and rescue coordinator who'd been doing this work for 20 years. They set up a command post near the abandoned SUV, using maps and GPS coordinates to track which areas had been searched and which still needed coverage. Odelia March stayed close to Luther, absorbing everything, asking occasional questions that showed she was thinking through the possibilities. Luther appreciated her focus. Some rookies would have been overwhelmed by now, but Odelia seemed to thrive under pressure. by 1,500 hours, the helicopter had made 3 more passes over the search area, using thermal imaging to scan for heat signatures. Nothing. If someone else was out there, they were either well hidden, sheltered from the thermal cameras, or already dead. Luther didn't voice that last possibility, but he knew everyone on the team was thinking it. The temperature was dropping again as the sun began its descent, and they had maybe 2 more hours of usable daylight. The incident commander approached Luther. "Trooper, we need to make a decision. If we don't find anything in the next hour, we're going to have to pull back and resume at first light. The conditions are getting too dangerous for the ground teams." Luther nodded, understanding the reality even if he didn't like it. "Give us 1 more hour. If Sandra Colfax saw someone out here, we need to know who and why." The commander agreed and returned to coordinating the teams. Luther turned to Adelia. "I want to go back to where we found Sandra. Sometimes people in distress will circle back to familiar locations, especially if they're disoriented. If there's someone else out here, they might be doing the same thing." Adelia grabbed her gear, and they headed back into the forest, retracing their path from the morning. The snow had been trampled by search teams now, making it harder to distinguish individual tracks, but Luther navigated by memory and GPS. When they reached the hollow where Sandra had been found, Luther stopped and surveyed the area with fresh eyes. The fallen tree created a natural shelter, which was probably why Sandra had gravitated toward it. But now Luther noticed something he hadn't seen earlier. On the far side of the tree, partially hidden by snow-covered branches, there was another set of tracks. These were larger, made by boots with a different tread pattern. They led away from the hollow, heading northeast deeper into the forest. Luther called Adelia over. "Look at this. These aren't Sandra's tracks. Someone else was here, and recently." Adelia crouched down, examining the prints. "Could be one of our search teams from this morning." Luther shook his head. "Our teams came from the west and south. These tracks are heading northeast, away from all our grid patterns. Whoever made these came through here before we found Sandra, or they deliberately avoided our search." He radioed the command post. "Command, Unit 19. We've found a second set of tracks at the location where we found Colfax. These appear to be from a male, larger boot size, heading northeast. I'm going to follow them for a short distance and see where they lead." The commander's voice came back, cautious. "Unit 19, you've got 45 minutes of good daylight left. Stay in radio contact and don't go beyond the range of our teams." Luther acknowledged and began following the new tracks. Adelia stayed close behind him, her hand resting near her sidearm. They both felt the shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a welfare check was evolving into something else. After about 200 yards, the tracks led them to a narrow ravine, steep-sided and filled with snow. The tracks descended into it, following what looked like a game trail. Luther hesitated. The ravine was treacherous, and if someone was down there waiting, they'd be at a tactical disadvantage. He made a decision. "Adelia, I want you to stay up here and keep a visual on me. If I run into trouble, you call for backup immediately, and do not come down after me. Understood?" Adelia looked like she wanted to argue, but she nodded. "Yes, sir. Be careful." Luther started down into the ravine, using trees and rocks for handholds. The descent was steep, and the snow was unstable, but he made it to the bottom without incident. The ravine floor was narrow, maybe 10 feet across, and the walls rose 15 feet on either side. The tracks continued along the ravine floor, heading east. Luther followed them, his flashlight cutting through the growing shadows. After another 50 yards, the ravine opened into a small box canyon, and Luther stopped dead in his tracks. In the center of the canyon was a camp, not a crude shelter like the one they'd found earlier, but a proper camp with a tent, a fire pit with fresh ashes, and supplies stacked neatly under a tarp. Someone had been living here, and recently. Luther approached cautiously, his hand on his sidearm. "Highway Patrol, if anyone is here, identify yourself." No response. Luther moved closer to the tent and pulled back the flap. Inside was a sleeping bag, some clothing, and a backpack. He pulled the backpack out and opened it carefully. Inside, he found several items that made his pulse quicken: a hunting knife, a pair of binoculars, a map of the area with several locations marked in red ink, and a small notebook. Luther opened the notebook and began reading. The entries were dated, going back about 2 weeks. Most were brief, noting weather conditions, supplies needed, and observations about the area. But one entry dated 3 days ago stood out. "She's back, same route, same time. Doesn't know I'm watching. Need to make contact soon." Luther felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Someone had been watching Sandra Colfax. He flipped to the last entry, dated yesterday. "She saw me, ran, had to follow. Can't let her leave without talking. Too important." Luther radioed immediately. "Command, Unit 19. I found a camp in a box canyon northeast of the Colfax recovery site. Occupant is not present, but there's evidence suggesting surveillance of Sandra Colfax. I need backup down here now." The commander's response was swift. "Unit 19, backup is en route. Do not proceed further. Secure the area and wait." Luther acknowledged, but his mind was racing. Who was living out here, and why were they watching Sandra? He continued searching the camp and found more items that deepened the mystery. A portable radio scanner tuned to the frequency used by local law enforcement and search teams. A digital camera with dozens of photos, mostly of the surrounding forest, but several of the highway and Sandra's SUV. And in the bottom of the backpack, a driver's license. The photo showed a man in his late 30s with a beard and weathered features. The name read, Garrett Mosley. Luther ran the name through dispatch while he waited for backup. The results came back quickly, and they were troubling. Garrett Mosley, age 38, had an extensive criminal record. Multiple arrests for trespassing, stalking, and harassment. He'd served 2 years in state prison for aggravated stalking of a former girlfriend, and he'd been released on parole 8 months ago. His last known address was in Great Falls, the same city where Sandra Colfax lived. Luther's jaw tightened. This wasn't a random encounter. Garrett Mosley had been stalking Sandra Colfax, following her to this remote location, and when she'd realized she was being watched, she'd fled into the forest. Within 20 minutes, backup arrived. 4 troopers descended into the ravine, along with Odelia, who looked relieved to see Luther unharmed. They secured the camp, photographing and cataloging everything. Luther briefed them on what he'd found, and the senior trooper, a sergeant named Hollis, made the call to expand the search specifically for Garrett Mosley. If he's been out here for 2 weeks, he knows this terrain better than we do. He could be anywhere, but we need to find him before he finds another victim, or before the cold gets him. Luther agreed, but something about the situation bothered him. If Mosley was a stalker, why hadn't he approached Sandra directly? Why set up camp and watch from a distance? Odelia voiced a similar concern. "Sir, if Mosley wanted to hurt her, he had plenty of opportunities. Why wait? Why just watch?" Luther considered it. Maybe he wasn't planning to hurt her. The notebook said he needed to talk to her, that it was important. Stalkers often have delusional beliefs about their relationship with their victims. He might have thought she wanted to see him, or that he could convince her of something. Sergeant Hollis added, "Or he's escalating. Watching isn't enough anymore, and he's moving toward direct contact. Either way, he's dangerous, and we need to bring him in." The search for Garrett Mosley continued into the evening, but it was called off when full darkness fell and the temperature dropped below zero. The teams would resume at dawn. Luther and Odelia returned to the barracks, where they filed supplemental reports and coordinated with detectives who were now treating this as a potential kidnapping or stalking case. Sandra Colfax was still in the hospital, sedated and recovering from severe hypothermia. The doctors said she'd be able to speak with investigators in a day or two, but for now, they had to piece together the story from the evidence. Luther sat in the break room with Odelia, both of them exhausted. Odelia broke the silence. "Do you think Mosley's still alive out there?" Luther sipped his coffee, considering. If he's been living in that camp for 2 weeks, he knows how to survive. But the cold's getting worse, and if he's running now, he might not have all his gear. I'd give him 48 hours at most before exposure becomes a real problem. Odelia nodded slowly. And if he finds another vehicle, or a cabin, or someone to help him? Luther met her eyes. Then, we've got a bigger problem. A man like Mosley, with his record, he's not going to stop. If Sandra Colfax was his target and she's now in protective custody, he'll either try to get to her or he'll find someone else. The next morning, the search resumed. The command post was moved closer to the Box Canyon, and additional resources were brought in, including K-9 units specifically trained for tracking fugitives. Luther and Odelia were assigned to a team searching the area north of the canyon, following a ridgeline that overlooked the highway. By 1,000 hours, one of the K-9 units picked up a scent trail. The trail led north for nearly 2 miles before descending toward the highway. As they approached the tree line near the road, Luther saw something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the snow on the shoulder, and boot prints leading from the forest to where a vehicle had been parked. Luther radioed command. "We've got vehicle tracks on the shoulder, approximately 2 miles north of the Box Canyon. It looks like Mosley made it to the highway and was picked up or stole a vehicle. I need an immediate bolo and a review of any traffic cameras in the area." The response was immediate, and within an hour they had a lead. A trucker had called in a suspicious encounter earlier that morning. He'd stopped at a rest area about 20 miles north and had given a ride to a man who'd flagged him down on the shoulder, claiming his car had broken down. The trucker had dropped the man off at a truck stop near the state line. The description matched Garrett Mosley. Luther and Odelia drove immediately to the truck stop. When they arrived, they found the trucker, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Briggs Talford, sitting in the diner nursing a cup of coffee. Luther approached him and showed his badge. "Mr. Talford, I'm Trooper Pritchard. I understand you gave a man a ride this morning?" Briggs nodded, his expression wary. "Yeah, I did. Felt bad for the guy, said he'd been stranded for hours. But the more I talked to him, the more something felt off. He was real nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. When I dropped him off here, he practically ran." Luther pulled out a photo of Garrett Mosley from his phone. "Is this the man?" Briggs studied the photo and nodded. "Yeah, that's him. Who is he?" Luther kept his voice neutral. "He's a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. Did he say where he was going?" Briggs shook his head. "No, but when I dropped him off, I saw him head toward the back lot where people park overnight. There's a few RVs and cars back there. I figured he was meeting someone." Luther thanked Briggs and immediately coordinated with Odelia to search the back lot. They found Mosley's trail quickly. He'd approached several vehicles, trying door handles, before finally breaking into an older sedan parked at the far edge of the lot. The window was smashed, and the ignition had been hot-wired. Mosley was gone, driving a stolen vehicle, and he had a significant head start. Luther put out an updated bolo with the stolen vehicle's description and plate number and he coordinated with state police across the region. Garrett Mosley was no longer just a stalker hiding in the woods. He was on the move, armed with knowledge of Sandra Colfax's location, and desperate. The manhunt had officially begun. The bolo for Garrett Mosley and the stolen sedan went out across 6 states within 2 hours. Luther Pritchard coordinated with the command center at the barracks, making sure every trooper, every sheriff's deputy, and every municipal officer had Mosley's photo and the vehicle description. The stolen car was a 2005 gray sedan with Montana plates, distinctive enough to spot but common enough that it wouldn't immediately draw attention. Mosley had a head start, but he was also driving a vehicle that had been reported stolen, which meant every traffic camera and every patrol unit was now a potential threat to him. Luther knew from experience that fugitives in stolen vehicles rarely made it more than a few hundred miles before making a mistake. By early afternoon, Sandra Colfax was conscious and able to speak with investigators. Luther and Odelia March drove to the hospital in Great Falls, where Sandra was being kept under observation. A detective from the Great Falls PD was already there, along with the victim advocate. Sandra looked fragile, propped up in the hospital bed with an IV in her arm and blankets piled high. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were alert. Luther introduced himself and Odelia, keeping his tone gentle. "Miss Colfax, I'm Trooper Pritchard. You're safe now, and we're here to help. But I need you to tell me about Garrett Mosley." Sandra's expression shifted immediately. Fear flickered across her face, and she pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "How do you know about him?" Luther sat down in the chair beside the bed. "We found his camp in the forest. We know he was watching you. I need to understand what happened between you two and why you ran." Sandra took a shaky breath. "Garrett is my ex-boyfriend. We dated about 3 years ago for maybe 6 months. It was a mistake. He was intense, possessive. When I tried to break up with him, he wouldn't accept it. He started showing up at my work, my apartment, calling me constantly. I had to get a restraining order." Luther made notes. "And then he was arrested." Sandra nodded. "Yes, he violated the restraining order multiple times, and eventually he was charged with stalking. He went to prison, and I thought that was the end of it. I moved on, I dated other people, changed jobs, tried to rebuild my life. But then, about 2 months ago, I started seeing him again. Not in person, but I'd see his car parked down the street from my apartment. I'd catch glimpses of him at the grocery store or the gym. He was always just far enough away that I couldn't prove it was deliberate, but I knew he was watching me." Odelia spoke up. "Did you report it to the police?" Sandra's voice was bitter. "I tried. I went to the police and told them Garrett was following me again. But they said, without concrete evidence, there was nothing they could do. His parole officer said he was checking in regularly and following all the conditions of his release. It was my word against his, and he was careful not to get close enough for me to prove anything." Luther felt a familiar frustration. The system was designed to protect people like Sandra, but it often fell short until something terrible happened. "So you decided to leave town?" Sandra nodded. "I thought if I went somewhere remote, somewhere he couldn't follow, I'd have time to think and figure out what to do. I told a few people I was going camping, but I didn't tell anyone exactly where. I drove out to Highway 287 because I used to go camping in that area with my family when I was a kid. I thought I'd be safe. But on the second day, I saw him. He was in the forest watching me from a distance. I panicked. I got in my car and tried to drive away, but I was so scared I wasn't thinking straight. I ended up pulling over and just running into the woods. I thought if I could hide, he wouldn't find me." Luther leaned forward. "Did Garrett try to approach you? Did he threaten you?" Sandra shook her head. No, that's the strange part. He didn't come after me aggressively. It was like he was just watching, waiting. When I ran, he followed, but he kept his distance. At one point, I thought I heard him calling my name, saying he just wanted to talk. But I couldn't trust that. I kept running until I couldn't run anymore. I don't even remember how I ended up where you found me. Everything just became a blur of cold and fear. Luther sat back, processing. Mosley's behavior fit a pattern he'd seen before in stalking cases. The obsessive need to be near the victim. The delusion that they could somehow repair the relationship or convince the victim to give them another chance. But Mosley had crossed a line by following Sandra into the wilderness. And now he'd escalated further by stealing a vehicle and going on the run. Luther's phone buzzed. It was a text from the command center. They had a possible sighting of the stolen sedan at a gas station near the Idaho border, about 90 miles west of Great Falls. Luther stood up. Sandra, we're going to do everything we can to find Garrett and bring him into custody. In the meantime, you're going to have protection here at the hospital. An officer will be stationed outside your room 24/7. Sandra looked at him with pleading eyes. You have to stop him. He won't give up. He'll keep coming until something terrible happens. Luther's voice was firm. We're going to stop him, I promise you that. He and Odelia left the hospital and immediately headed west toward the Idaho border. The drive took just over an hour, and by the time they arrived at the gas station, 2 local sheriff's deputies were already on scene. The gas station attendant had confirmed that a man matching Mosley's description had stopped there about 90 minutes earlier, filled up the tank with cash, and bought some food and water before driving off. Luther reviewed the security footage with the deputies. The video clearly showed Garrett Mosley, looking disheveled and exhausted, but moving with purpose. He'd kept his head down, avoided making eye contact with anyone, and had been in and out of the station in less than 5 minutes. The timestamp on the footage gave them a window. If Mosley had continued west, he'd be crossing into Idaho within the hour. Luther coordinated with Idaho State Police to set up checkpoints on the major highways, but he knew Mosley was smart enough to avoid main roads if he suspected a manhunt. Odelia studied the map on her tablet. Sir, if he's heading west, there are dozens of back roads and rural routes he could take. We can't cover them all. Luther nodded. Which is why we need to think like him. He's running, but he's also trying to stay close to Sandra. He's obsessed with her. Even though she's in protective custody, his pattern suggests he won't go far. He'll find a place to lay low, wait for an opportunity. Odelia frowned. You think he'll try to come back for her? Luther's expression was grim. I think he'll try to get to her, yes. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. And we need to catch him before he gets that chance. They spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating with local agencies, reviewing traffic camera footage, and following up on reported sightings. By evening, they had a clearer picture. Mosley had ditched the stolen sedan at a rest area just inside the Idaho border, and had likely hitched another ride or stolen another vehicle. A truck driver reported picking up a man matching Mosley's description and dropping him off at a small town called Kenton, about 30 miles south of the border. Luther and Odelia drove to Kenton, arriving just after dark. The town was tiny, maybe 300 residents with a single main street lined with a few shops, a diner, and a motel. Luther went directly to the motel, a rundown establishment called the Pine Rest Inn. The clerk, an elderly man with thick glasses, confirmed that a man matching Mosley's description had checked in about 2 hours earlier, paying cash for one night and giving a fake name. Luther's pulse quickened. What room? The clerk checked his ledger. Room 9, around back. Luther radioed for backup, then turned to Odelia. We're going to sit on that room until backup arrives. No approach until we have adequate coverage. Understood?" Odelia nodded, her hand resting on her sidearm. They positioned their cruiser at the far end of the motel parking lot, with a clear view of room 9. The lights were on inside, and through the thin curtains, Luther could see a figure moving around. Backup arrived within 15 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies and another state trooper. They formed a tactical plan. Luther and the senior deputy would approach the door and make contact, while the others covered the rear exit and flanks. It was straightforward by the book. They moved into position silently, weapons drawn, but held low. Luther reached the door of room 9 and knocked firmly. "Garrett Mosley, this is the highway patrol. We need you to come out with your hands visible." There was a long pause, then the sound of movement inside. Luther knocked again, louder this time. "Mosley, do not make this harder than it needs to be. Come out now." The door opened a crack, and Luther saw Garrett Mosley's face. He looked haggard, eyes bloodshot, beard unkempt. He didn't try to run or fight. He just stood there, staring at Luther with an expression that was equal parts resignation and desperation. "I just wanted to talk to her," Mosley said quietly. Luther kept his weapon trained on him. "Hands where I can see them. Step out slowly." Mosley complied, raising his hands and stepping out onto the walkway. The deputies moved in quickly, cuffing him and conducting a pat-down. Luther holstered his weapon and approached. "Garrett Mosley, you're under arrest for stalking, violation of a restraining order, auto theft, and evading arrest. You have the right to remain silent." Luther read him his full Miranda rights while Mosley stood silently, not resisting, not speaking. Once Mosley was secured in the back of a patrol vehicle, Luther returned to the motel room to conduct a search. Inside, he found Mosley's belongings: a backpack with clothes, some cash, and a folder filled with photos. Photos of Sandra Colfax, hundreds of them, taken over months, maybe years. Photos of her leaving her apartment, shopping, at work, laughing with friends. It was a stalker's archive, obsessive and deeply disturbing. Luther also found a notebook, similar to the one they'd found in the forest camp. The entries were rambling, almost stream of consciousness. Mosley wrote about how Sandra was the only person who'd ever understood him, how their relationship had been perfect until she'd been manipulated by others into leaving him. He wrote about watching her from a distance, protecting her from dangers she didn't even know existed. The delusion was complete. In Mosley's mind, he wasn't stalking Sandra. He was guarding her, waiting for the moment when she'd realize she needed him. Luther felt a wave of revulsion as he bagged the evidence. This was what Sandra had been running from. Not just a man, but an obsession that had consumed him completely. Luther returned to the patrol vehicle where Mosley sat in the back seat, staring out the window. Luther opened the door and crouched down. "Garrett, I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to be honest with me. Were you planning to hurt Sandra?" Mosley's head turned slowly, and he looked at Luther with genuine confusion. "Hurt her? No. I'd never hurt her. I love her. I just needed to explain, to make her understand that we belong together." Luther's jaw tightened. "You stalked her, terrorized her, and chased her into the woods in the middle of winter. She almost died because of you." Mosley's expression didn't change. "She ran because she was scared. But she didn't need to be. I would never hurt her. I just needed her to listen." Luther stood up and closed the door. There was no reasoning with someone this far gone. Mosley would be processed, charged, and hopefully locked away for a long time. But Luther knew the system, knew that even with overwhelming evidence, Mosley might eventually get out again. and when he did, the cycle could start all over. Luther and Odelia escorted Mosley back to Montana, where he was booked into the county jail. The charges were extensive, and the district attorney was confident they could secure a conviction. Sandra Colfax was informed of the arrest, and Luther saw the relief in her face when he told her. But he also saw the lingering fear, the knowledge that even with Mosley in custody, the trauma of what she'd been through would stay with her for a long time. As Luther and Odelia returned to the barracks that night, Odelia broke the silence. "Do you think she'll ever feel safe again?" Luther stared at the dark highway ahead. "I don't know. Cases like this, they leave scars that don't heal easily. We did our job, we stopped him before he could hurt her. But the fear he created, that's something she'll have to work through on her own." Odelia nodded slowly, and they drove the rest of the way in silence. Luther thought about Sandra Colfax running through the forest, driven by terror, and about Garrett Mosley sitting in his camp, convinced his obsession was love. The line between protection and control had blurred for Mosley until he couldn't see it anymore. And that, Luther knew, was what made men like him so dangerous. The arrest of Garrett Mosley should have been the end of it. Luther Pritchard filed his reports, testified at the preliminary hearing, and watched as Mosley was denied bail and remanded to custody pending trial. The evidence was overwhelming. The stalking documentation, the photos, the stolen vehicles, the violation of parole. The district attorney was confident they'd secure a conviction that would keep Mosley locked up for at least a decade. Sandra Colfax had returned to Great Falls, working with a victim advocate and a therapist to process what she'd been through. By all accounts, the case was closed. But Luther couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. It started 3 weeks after Mosley's arrest. Luther was working a night shift with Odelia March when dispatch called with a report of suspicious activity near Sandra Colfax's apartment building in Great Falls. A neighbor had reported seeing someone loitering in the parking lot, watching the building. By the time a patrol unit arrived, the person was gone, but the neighbor provided a description. Male, an average height, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap. It could have been anyone, but Luther felt a familiar unease. He called the Great Falls PD detective handling Sandra's case. "Has anyone been checking on Sandra since Mosley was arrested?" The detective confirmed that they'd been doing periodic welfare checks, and Sandra had reported no issues. Luther decided to follow up himself. The next morning, he and Odelia drove to Great Falls and met with Sandra at her apartment. She looked better than she had in the hospital, more color in her face, but there was still a wariness in her eyes. Luther got straight to the point. "Sandra, have you noticed anyone following you or watching you since Garrett was arrested?" Sandra hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but yes. A few times in the last week I've had this feeling like someone's watching me. I'll see a car parked down the street that wasn't there before, or I'll catch someone looking at me in a store and they'll turn away too quickly, but I can't prove anything." Luther's concern deepened. "Have you seen anyone you recognize? Anyone from Garrett's life, maybe a friend or family member?" Sandra shook her head. "Garrett didn't have many friends. His family lives out of state, and as far as I know, they disowned him after his first arrest. But," she trailed off, and Luther waited. "There was someone. When Garrett and I were dating, he talked about this guy he'd met in prison during a previous sentence. Someone he said understood him, someone who'd been through similar things. He never told me the guy's name, but I got the impression they stayed in touch after Garrett was released." Luther exchanged a glance with Odelia. A prison contact. That opened up a new avenue of investigation. "Sandra, did Garrett ever mention what this person looked like or where he lived?" Sandra thought for a moment. "No, but Garrett said the guy had helped him with legal stuff, like filing appeals or something. He said the guy was smart, really smart, and that he owed him. Luther made notes and promised Sandra they'd look into it. Before leaving, he arranged for increased patrols around her building and gave her his direct number, telling her to call immediately if she saw anything suspicious. Back at the barracks, Luther dove into Garrett Mosley's prison records. He pulled up the list of inmates Mosley had been housed with during his 2-year sentence and began cross-referencing them with parole records and known associates. It took hours, but eventually he found something. An inmate named Dennis Kroll had been in the same cell block as Mosley for 16 months. Kroll had been serving time for burglary and identity theft, and he'd been released on parole 6 months before Mosley. His last known address was in Helena, about 90 miles from Great Falls. Luther ran a full background check on Dennis Kroll. The man was 42 years old, no violent offenses on his record, but a long history of property crimes and fraud. He'd been arrested multiple times, but had always managed to get reduced sentences through plea deals. Luther noted that Kroll had a reputation for being intelligent and manipulative, exactly the kind of person who might appeal to someone like Mosley. Luther called the parole office and confirmed that Kroll was still checking in regularly and had violated no conditions of his release. On paper, he was clean, but Luther's instincts told him otherwise. He and Odelia drove to Helena the next day. Kroll's listed address was a small apartment complex on the edge of town. They knocked on his door, and after a moment, it opened. Dennis Kroll was a thin man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. He looked at Luther's uniform and smiled slightly. "Can I help you, Trooper?" Luther showed his badge. "I'm Trooper Pritchard. This is Trooper March. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Garrett Mosley." Kroll's expression didn't change. "Garrett? Sure, I know him. We were in prison together. What about him?" Luther kept his tone neutral. "When was the last time you had contact with him?" Kroll leaned against the doorframe. "I don't know. Maybe a month ago. We talked on the phone a few times after he got out. He was having a hard time adjusting, and I tried to give him some advice. Why, is he in trouble again?" Luther watched Kroll carefully. The man's body language was too relaxed, his answers too smooth. "He's been arrested for stalking and other charges. We're following up with people who had recent contact with him." Kroll nodded slowly. "That's a shame. Garrett always had a problem with letting go of things. I told him he needed to move on, but he wouldn't listen." Odelia spoke up. "Did he ever mention Sandra Colfax to you?" Kroll's eyes flicked to her, and for just a moment Luther saw something behind the mask. Recognition. Maybe calculation. "He mentioned her, yeah. Said she was the love of his life, that kind of thing. I told him he needed to forget about her, that it was unhealthy. But like I said, Garrett didn't listen." Luther decided to push. "Have you been to Great Falls in the last few weeks, Mr. Kroll?" Kroll's smile returned. "No, Trooper. I've been right here in Helena, working and staying out of trouble. You can check with my parole officer if you don't believe me." Luther knew they didn't have enough to detain or question Kroll further without more evidence. He thanked Kroll for his cooperation and left with Odelia. Once they were back in the cruiser, Odelia turned to him. "He's lying. You saw the way he reacted when I mentioned Sandra's name." Luther nodded. "I know. But we can't prove anything yet. We need surveillance. We need to catch him doing something concrete." Over the next week, Luther coordinated with the Helena PD to keep tabs on Dennis Kroll. They tracked his movements, noting that he left his apartment frequently, often in the evening, and drove a nondescript sedan. On 2 occasions, patrol units followed him as far as the Great Falls city limits before losing him in traffic. Luther's suspicions were confirmed when Sandra called him late one night, her voice shaking. "He's here, outside my building. I saw him through the window, the same man I've been seeing all week." He's just standing there looking up at my apartment." Luther was already moving. "Sandra, lock your doors and stay away from the windows. I'm calling Great Falls PD right now, and I'm on my way." He dispatched units immediately, and within minutes, officers were on scene. They found a man matching Dennis Kroll's description walking away from Sandra's building. They detained him for questioning, and Luther arrived 30 minutes later. Kroll was sitting in an interview room at the Great Falls PD station, looking smug and unworried. Luther sat down across from him. "You want to tell me what you were doing outside Sandra Colfax's apartment tonight?" Kroll shrugged. "I was taking a walk. It's a public street. Last I checked, that's not a crime." Luther leaned forward. "You're on parole, Mr. Kroll. One of the conditions is that you don't engage in behavior that could constitute harassment or stalking. Being outside the home of a stalking victim, especially one connected to your friend Garrett Mosley, qualifies." Kroll's smile faded slightly. "I didn't know she lived there. It was just a coincidence." Luther didn't buy it. "Coincidence? You've been seen near her building multiple times over the past 2 weeks. We have witness statements, patrol reports, and now we have you at the scene. You're violating your parole, and I'm recommending you be remanded to custody." Kroll's facade cracked. "You can't do that. I haven't done anything illegal." Luther's voice was hard. "You've been stalking a woman on behalf of your friend who's sitting in jail for doing the same thing. That makes you an accessory, and it violates the terms of your release. You're done." Kroll was taken into custody that night, and a search of his apartment revealed more damning evidence. He had a burner phone with dozens of calls to Garrett Mosley's lawyer, as well as handwritten notes detailing Sandra's daily routine: where she worked, what time she left her apartment, where she shopped. Kroll had been surveilling Sandra on Mosley's behalf, acting as his eyes and ears while Mosley sat in jail. The district attorney added new charges: conspiracy to stalk, harassment, and parole violation. Kroll's bail was denied, and he joined Mosley in custody, awaiting trial. Luther met with Sandra one last time to inform her that both Mosley and Kroll were behind bars and that she was safe. Sandra cried, a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I thought it would never end," she said quietly. Luther placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over now. They can't hurt you anymore." But even as he said the words, Luther knew the truth. The physical threat was gone, but the psychological damage would take much longer to heal. Sandra would carry the fear with her, the knowledge that she'd been hunted, watched, and terrorized by men who believed they had a right to her life. A month later, Garrett Mosley pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a 20-year sentence. Dennis Kroll went to trial and was convicted on all counts, receiving a 10-year sentence. Luther attended both sentencings, sitting in the gallery as the judge handed down the verdicts. He watched as Mosley was led away in shackles, his face blank, showing no remorse or understanding of what he'd done. Kroll, by contrast, looked angry, as if he'd been wronged by a system that didn't appreciate his loyalty to a friend. Luther felt no satisfaction, only a weary sense of completion. Odelia March had proven herself throughout the case, handling the pressure and complexity with maturity beyond her experience. Luther submitted a commendation for her work, and she was officially cleared to work solo shifts. On her last day riding with Luther, they drove the same stretch of Highway 287 where it had all started. The snow had melted now, replaced by the green of early spring, and the abandoned SUV was long gone. Odelia broke the silence. "Do you think she'll be okay, Sandra?" Luther kept his eyes on the road. "I think she'll survive. Whether she'll be okay, that depends on a lot of things. But she's stronger than she knows, and she ran when she needed to run, and she fought to stay alive. That takes courage." Odelia nodded thoughtfully. This job isn't what I expected. In the academy, they teach you about procedure, about tactics and law, but they don't really prepare you for the people, for the victims who live with the aftermath. Luther glanced at her. No, they don't. That's something you learn on the job. You did good work, March. You asked the right questions, you stayed focused, and you helped bring 2 dangerous men to justice. That's what the job is about. Not glory, not headlines, just doing what's right when it matters. They drove the rest of the patrol in comfortable silence, 2 troopers on a quiet highway watching for trouble but hoping for peace. Months later, Luther received a letter from Sandra Colfax. She'd moved to a different state, started a new job, and was slowly rebuilding her life. She thanked him for everything he'd done, for believing her when others had dismissed her fears, and for not giving up when the case became complicated. She wrote that she still had nightmares sometimes, still looked over her shoulder more than she should, but that she was learning to live with it. She ended the letter with a simple sentence: "You gave me my life back." Luther folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, next to the commendations and case files that marked his career. He thought about the abandoned SUV, the footprints in the snow, and the woman who'd nearly died because someone believed love gave them ownership. He thought about Garrett Mosley's delusion and Dennis Kroll's misguided loyalty. And he thought about the system that had failed Sandra until it was almost too late. The highway stretched out before him, empty and quiet, waiting for the next call, the next crisis, the next person who needed help. Luther started the engine and pulled out of the barracks, back onto the road where he belonged. The work was never done, and the stories never ended. But as long as he wore the badge, he'd keep showing up, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. That was the promise he'd made, and it was one he intended to keep.